The sky above the Nazir excavation site did not break, it tore. It was not the gentle shifting of tides or the slow erosion of stone that marked the end of the world, but a violent rip in the fabric of the air itself. Zachary stood near the edge of the crater, her robe stiff with the dust of the desert floor, watching the monolith rise from the earth like a black finger accusing the heavens. The stone, known to the few who studied it as stellacite, was impossibly hard. Generations of masons had failed to scratch its surface with iron, yet now it hummed with a vibration that rattled the teeth in the skulls of the gathered scholars. Beside her, Sindril tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white against the leather. He did not look at the stone, he looked at Balor. The sorcerer's ambition had consumed him, twisting his face into a mask of ecstatic greed. Balor believed he could harness the chaos, that he could pull power from the rift and bend it to his will. He spoke of a new order, a realm where the laws of men would bow to the laws of magic. Sindril knew better. He had seen the scrolls, the forbidden texts that whispered of the spheres colliding. He knew that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. The ground beneath them began to shudder, not with the rhythm of an earthquake, but with the thrum of a living thing waking up. Balor raised his hands, his voice cutting through the rising wind. He chanted words that did not belong to any language spoken in Sintra or Redania, sounds that scraped against the ear like nails on slate. The monolith flared, a pulse of violet light that blinded the onlookers. Zachary felt the pressure in her chest, a physical weight as if the air itself had turned to water. She looked at Sindril and saw the resolve hardening in his friend's eyes. There would be no turning back. The ritual had reached a point of no return. Balor's power was a river overflowing its banks, and the only way to stop the flood was to break the dam. Sindril stepped forward, ignoring the warning shouts of the other mages. He moved with the deliberate speed of a man who had already accepted his end. He knew that Balor sought to become a god, but gods required sacrifices. Sindril would be the price. The explosion that followed was not fire, but a wave of pure force. It hit the monolith, and the black stone did not shatter. It dissolved into a mist of swirling colors. The sky above Nazir ripped open, revealing not the stars of the continent, but a chaotic swirl of alien constellations. The air filled with the scent of ozone and rotting meat. From the rift poured things that had no business existing in this world. They were not merely monsters. They were fragments of a universe where the rules of biology were suggestions rather than laws. A creature with the skin of a leshy, but the face of a demon stumbled out, its eyes glowing with a cold green light. It was the Chernobog, a being of pure malice, and it moved with a fluid grace that made the soldiers around Zachary drop their spears in terror. Another form, a myriapod with 100 legs clicking against the stone, scuttled into the light, its chitinous shell reflecting the violet flare of the rift. Zachary screamed a command, her voice lost in the roar of the collision. She cast a barrier, a dome of golden light that shattered the moment it touched the chaotic wind. The barrier held for a heartbeat, then fractured like glass. The creatures surged forward, not with the coordinated strategy of an army, but with the mindless hunger of a plague. The soldiers of the order fell quickly, their armor useless against claws that could cut through steel as if it were parchment. Sindril stood his ground, his sword raised. He did not try to kill the Chernobog. He knew it was impossible. Instead, he ran toward the monolith, toward the source of the rift. Balor, his face twisted in triumph, turned to face his former friend. He laughed, a sound that was half man, half beast. "You cannot stop the future, Sindral," he shouted, his voice distorted by the magic that was now consuming him. "The spheres have merged. We are the masters now." Sindral did not answer. He threw himself at the sorcerer, his sword aiming for the heart. Balor raised a hand, and a bolt of violet energy struck Sindral in the chest. The impact threw the knight backward, but he did not fall. He used his momentum to slam his body into the monolith, his blood soaking into the black stone. He poured his own life force into the structure, a final act of defiance. The monolith groaned, the sound of a dying god. The rift began to collapse, the alien sky folding back into itself. Balor screamed as the connection to the chaos severed, the power that had sustained him draining away into the void. The Chernobog and the Myriapod froze, their forms flickering like bad memories. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the rift snapped shut. The monolith remained, a scar on the landscape, but the immediate threat was gone. Balor lay dead, his body reduced to ash by the backlash of his own magic. Sindral was gone too, his sacrifice the price for the survival of the world. The aftermath was not a victory. It was a tragedy disguised as a reprieve. The creatures that had arrived did not vanish entirely. Some had taken root in the soil of the continent, adapting to the new environment. The Neckers, small and vicious, were the first to be seen in the forests of Velen. They were not the Neckers of legend, but something stronger, something changed by the proximity of the rift. A variant known as the Carnage Necker emerged, its skin a sickly green with vivid red undertones, its face painted in black war paint. These warriors did not fight for territory or food. They fought with a cruelty that was atypical for their kind. They tore through villages, leaving nothing but bone and ash. The people of the northern realms did not know that these monsters were remnants of the conjunction. They only knew that the world had changed, that the safety of their homes was an illusion. The monoliths remained scattered across the land, silent sentinels of the event. The one at Nazir was buried under the rubble, hidden from the eyes of the curious. Others stood tall in places like the Sintran Pillar at Marnadel or the hidden tower at Tor Lara. They were made of stellacite, a substance so hard it would take a generation to put a dent in it. Mages studied them, trying to understand the power that had nearly destroyed the world. They failed to see the truth. The monoliths were not just sources of power, they were portals. They were doors that could be opened again, and the key was not magic but blood. Centuries later, a girl named Ciri would learn this truth. Her screams would shatter the monoliths, calling forth new monsters from the other side. She would topple the pillars of Ard Geith in Zentria and the hidden stone in the medallion tree at Kaer Morhen. She would be the living key to the gates that Sindral had tried to close. The world moved on, but the scars remained. The stories of the conjunction became myths, then legends, then forgotten truths. The people of the northern realms built their castles and their cities, unaware that the ground beneath them was unstable. The monsters that had arrived were just the beginning. The conjunction of the spheres had not just brought monsters, it had brought a new reality, one where the laws of nature were fluid. The elves, the humans, the dwarves, all lived in a world that was no longer their own. The stars in the sky were different now, shifted by the collision of spheres. The silence that followed the event was not peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, waiting for the next disaster. The mages who survived the Nazir incident wrote their reports, but they buried the truth. They did not want the world to know that the monsters were not an invasion, but a migration. The spheres had collided, and there was no going back. The memory of Sindral faded, replaced by the memory of the monsters. The Carnage Neckers became a symbol of the new world, a reminder that the old rules no longer applied. The people of the northern realms learned to fear the dark, not because of the night, but because of what might come out of it. The monoliths stood as silent witnesses to the folly of men. They were the proof that the stars could collide, that the barriers between worlds could be broken. The story of Balor and Sindral was a cautionary tale, a warning that power without wisdom was a path to destruction. But the warning was not heard. The world continued to turn, and the monsters continued to hunt. The conjunction had changed everything, and the world would never be the same. The silence of the monoliths was not empty. It was full of the ghosts of the past, waiting for the day when the doors would open again. The stars had collided, and the monsters had arrived. The first conjunction was over, but the war for the soul of the world had just begun. Long before the stars tore the sky, the world knew only the footsteps of the elder races. They did not build their homes with the frantic haste of men, nor did they fear the dark as a void to be filled. Their history was carved into the living stone of the mountains and the ancient roots of the forests, a timeline measured in centuries rather than seasons. The elves, those slender children of the fire and the leaf, walked the earth with a grace that made the very air seem to bow before them. They were the first to name the rivers, the first to understand that the wind carried voices if one knew how to listen. To them, the land was not a resource to be consumed, but a companion to be courted. Enev, a wanderer who would later be called Iskra, understood this bond even as she was cast out by her own kin. She did not see the forest as a cage, but as a vast, breathing entity that had failed her. Her exile was not a death sentence, but a test of whether she could survive without the protection of her tribe. She found Giselher pinned to an oak tree by an arrow, his life bleeding out into the moss. She did not turn away. She pulled the shaft from his flesh and bound his wound with her own hands. In that moment, two outcasts became a pair, and the forest watched them, indifferent yet witness to their new pact. The dwarves, meanwhile, had turned their backs on the open sky to dwell in the deep places of the earth. They were the masters of the hammer and the forge, shaping the very bones of the world to serve their will. Their cities were not built upon the soil but carved into the bedrock, vast cathedrals of stone lit by the glow of molten metal. They did not fear the dark, they commanded it. To a dwarf, the mountain was a temple, and every vein of ore was a gift from the earth to be honored with labor. They traded with the elves, exchanging gold for song, but the two races remained distinct, separated by the nature of their hearts. The elves sought to blend with the world, the dwarves sought to shape it. Both were ancient, both were powerful, and both were destined to lose their dominion. The arrival of the humans was not a conquest but a slow erosion, a tide of newcomers who built their cities on the ruins of the old ones. The elves and dwarves watched as the forests were felled and the mountains were tunneled. They saw the humans rise, not through wisdom or magic, but through sheer numbers and an insatiable hunger for the land. The elder races did not fight a war to keep their home. They fought a losing battle to survive it. Their great halls fell silent, their cities were abandoned to the rats and the moss, and their people scattered into the shadows. Yet even in their decline they remained. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The story of Iskra and her gang, the Rats, is an echo of that lost age, a final flicker of elven fire in a world that had forgotten how to burn. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. The first human footprints on the continent were not carved in stone, but stamped into the soft mud of the riverbanks. They came from the north, where the ice had retreated just enough to reveal the skeletal remains of forests waiting to be reborn. These were not the disciplined legions of a king, but a ragged tide of families dragging carts, leading scrawny cattle, and carrying seeds wrapped in oilcloth. They called themselves many names, but the history of the continent would soon know them as one: the newcomers. They did not seek to understand the magic that hummed in the roots of the elder trees. They sought to cut the trees down to build a roof. The migration began as a trickle and swelled into a flood that no dike could hold. The elves, who had watched the seasons turn for millennia, saw the green of the Edirnian plains turn brown as the axe fell. They saw the dwarves emerge from their mountain holds, not to trade gold for song, but to trade iron for the right to pass through a valley. The humans moved with a terrifying efficiency. Where an elf would spend a lifetime learning the name of a river, a human spent a day building a bridge across it. Where a dwarf would negotiate with a spirit of the stone, a human drove a spike into the bedrock and built a tower. In the year that would later be marked as the turning of the Great Wheel, a man named Spirit and Ap stood in the mud of a small village called Forest Dam. He did not look like a conqueror. He wore the rough-spun tunic of a farmer and carried a chisel in his calloused hand. He was not there to kill or to burn. He was there to remember. Before him stood a simple obelisk of local granite, freshly raised to mark the spot where the prophet Lebioda had once spoken. The prophet's voice had been a whisper, but Apps heard a warning in the wind. He knew that the old ways were slipping away, replaced by a new hunger that could not be sated by the land alone. He carved the date into the stone, a final testament to a time when men and elves still looked at each other with curiosity rather than fear. The stone would stand for a time, but the forest around it would eventually be felled for the fire of a human hearth. The cost of this expansion was written in the silence of the abandoned elven cities. Great halls that had echoed with the music of harps and the laughter of children were left to the moss. The humans did not enter these places with reverence. They saw them as quarries. They took the marble for their own churches and the timber for their ships. They did not understand that the stones held memories. They did not know that the silence of the ruins was not empty, but waiting. The elves retreated, not in defeat, but in a slow, sorrowful withdrawal. They moved deeper into the woods, into the places where the light was thin, and the paths were known only to those who had lived there since the world was young. The dwarves fared little better. Their great forges, once the beating heart of the continent, grew cold as the humans learned to smelt iron in open pits. The humans were not better craftsmen, but they were faster. They did not care for the perfection of a blade. They cared only that it could cut. They flooded the markets with cheap steel, driving the dwarven artisans out of the cities they had built. The dwarves retreated into their mountains, sealing the gates behind them. They became a people of stone and shadow, watching the humans rise and fall on the surface, waiting for a day that might never come when the world would remember the value of true work. The humans did not stop. They pushed west, then east, then south. They built cities of wood and stone that sprang up overnight, defying the natural order of the land. They named the rivers and the mountains, erasing the old names with a single stroke of the quill. They claimed the land as their own, as if the earth had been waiting for them to arrive. They did not see the ghosts of the elder races walking among them. They did not hear the whispers of the trees or the groans of the mountains. They were too busy building their own world to notice that they were living in someone else's grave. One of the first to feel the weight of this change was a young woman named Adalia. She was not a queen or a warrior, but a daughter of a minor noble house in the north. She watched as her family's lands were swallowed by the expanding borders of the new kingdoms. She saw the forests that had been her childhood playground turn into fields of wheat. She saw the rivers that had been sacred to her people turn into canals for the transport of grain. She did not fight. She knew that she could not stop the tide. But she remembered the stories her grandmother told her of the elves and the dwarves. She remembered the songs of the old world, the songs that spoke of a time when the land was alive and the people were part of it. She kept these stories in her heart, even as the world around her turned to stone and steel. The migration was not a single event, but a slow, grinding process that took generations. It was a war of attrition, fought not with swords and arrows, but with plows and hammers. The humans did not conquer the continent, they consumed it. They ate the forests, they drank the rivers, and they built their cities on the bones of the elder races. They were the great devourers, the endless hunger that would never be sated. Yet even as the humans rose, the elder races did not vanish. They became the shadows that stretched long across the new world. They were the whispers in the wind, the ghosts in the ruins, the memories of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. They waited in the dark, watching the humans rise and fall, knowing that the cycle would eventually turn. The humans would build their cities, and the elves would wait in the woods. The dwarves would sleep in their mountains, and the humans would dream of the gold they would find. The story of the continent was no longer the story of the elder races. It was the story of the humans, the story of their rise, their fall, and their endless hunger for the land. But the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor, and the echoes of their songs still lingered in the wind. The humans had taken the stage, but the play was not over. The elder races were still there, waiting for the day when the humans would remember the cost of their conquest. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. The migration had changed the world, but it had not destroyed it. The world was still there, waiting for the next chapter to be written. The humans had written the first page, but the story was far from over. The elder races were still there, waiting for the day when the humans would remember the cost of their conquest. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. The migration had changed the world, but it had not destroyed it. The world was still there, waiting for the next chapter to be written. The humans had written the first page, but the story was far from over. The elder races were still there, waiting for the day when the humans would remember the cost of their conquest. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. The first human footprints on the continent were not carved in stone, but stamped into the soft mud of the riverbanks. They came from the north, where the ice had retreated just enough to reveal the skeletal remains of a world the elves had once called home. These new arrivals did not walk with the grace of the Aen Seidin, nor did they move with the heavy, deliberate tread of the dwarves. They marched. They marched in lines that stretched for miles, carrying spears that looked crude compared to the silver-tipped lances of the elven guards, yet they moved with a terrifying uniformity. The elders of the Aen El had watched them from the high towers of their cities, expecting them to scatter like birds at the approach of a storm. Instead, the humans dug trenches. They built wooden palisades that rose against the sky, blocking the view of the stars the elves had revered for millennia. They did not ask for permission. They did not seek an audience with the high kings. They simply took. The initial contact was not a grand battle of armies, but a series of small, brutal skirmishes that turned into a war of attrition. In the forest of Broccolin, the Dryads tried to reason with the settlers, weaving spells of confusion to send them back across the mountains. The humans did not stop. They brought axes that could fell ancient oaks in a single stroke. They brought fire. The trees that had stood for 3,000 years, the very pillars of the Dryads' existence, were reduced to ash. The Dryads fled into the deeper thickets, their connection to the land severed by the smoke that choked the air. They whispered of a time when the forest was a sanctuary, but the smoke did not care for their memories. The humans needed wood for their homes, and they needed land for their crops. The forest was just an obstacle in the way of their survival. The cities of the elves fell one by one, not with the crash of a single siege, but with the slow erosion of hope. In the great city of Dal Blathana, the last stand of the Aen Seidin was a desperate gamble. King Eredin, a name that would later be spoken in fear, did not yet rule. It was his grandfather, a lesser-known chieftain, who ordered the gates to be closed. The humans surrounded the city, cutting off the water supply from the river below. They did not attack the walls immediately. They waited. They let the hunger do their work. Inside the walls, the fine silk of the elven nobility rotted in the heat of the summer. The granaries were empty. The fountains ran dry. The people began to eat the leaves of the garden trees. The chieftain looked out from the western tower, watching the human fires burn on the hills. He saw the movement of thousands of men, the glint of iron, the sheer scale of the machine they had built. He realized that the magic of the elves, which had once bent the wind and the water, could not stop a starving army from breaking a gate. He ordered the gates opened, not in surrender, but in a final, futile attempt to negotiate. The humans did not negotiate. They charged. The slaughter that followed was not a battle. It was a harvest. The displacement was total. The elves, once the masters of the continent, were pushed into the mountains, the deep forests, and the swamps. They became the monsters in the human bedtime stories. The humans renamed the lands. They gave the rivers new names, names that were easier to pronounce, names that did not carry the weight of elven history. The dwarves, who had mined the deep earth for eons, found their tunnels blocked by human engineers who wanted the gold for their own coffers. The gnomes, small and clever, were forced to hide in the cellars of human cities, trading their knowledge for scraps of food. The world that had been a tapestry of many threads was now a single, coarse cloth woven by human hands. The half-elves, the children of unions that had once been celebrated, were now outcasts. They were too human for the elves, who saw them as traitors, and too elfish for the humans, who saw them as spies. They wandered the roads, hiding their pointed ears under hoods, their eyes darting for danger. They were the living proof of a time that no longer existed. The humans did not stop at the borders of the old kingdoms. They pushed further, into the lands of the trolls and the giants. These creatures, once left alone by the elves as dangerous but manageable neighbors, were now hunted. The humans saw them as resources. The skin of a troll could make a shield that could withstand a battering ram. The bones of a giant could make a bridge that would last 100 years. The humans did not see the intelligence in the eyes of the trolls. They did not see the complex societies of the giants. They saw only meat and bone. The trolls fought back, of course. They crushed human caravans and burned human villages. But the humans had numbers. They had steel. They had a willingness to die that the trolls did not understand. The trolls died in the thousands, their bodies left to rot in the mud. The humans took their lands and built farms on the graves of their enemies. The cost of this conquest was not just the blood of the elder races. It was the loss of a world. The magic that had flowed through the land, the subtle hum that the elves could hear and the dwarves could feel, began to fade. It was not gone, but it was retreating. It was hiding in the cracks of the world, waiting for the humans to tire. The humans, for their part, did not feel the loss. They were too busy building. They were too busy fighting. They were too busy surviving. They believed that the land belonged to them because they had conquered it. They did not understand that the land was not a possession. It was a living thing, and it was remembering. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. The migration had changed the world, but it had not destroyed it. The world was still there, waiting for the next chapter to be written. The humans had written the first page, but the story was far from over. The elder races were still there, waiting for the day when the humans would remember the cost of their conquest. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The humans had written the first page, but the story was far from over. The elder races were still there, waiting for the day when the humans would remember the cost of their conquest. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. The migration had changed the world, but it had not destroyed it. The world was still there, waiting for the next chapter to be written. The humans had written the first page, but the story was far from over. The elder races were still there, waiting for the day when the humans would remember the cost of their conquest. They were the ghosts in the machine of the new world, the memory of a time when the earth was not a battlefield. The humans had taken the stage, but the shadows of the elder races still stretched long across the floor. In the end, the humans built their cities on the ruins of the elven towers. They paved the streets with stones that had once been part of elven altars. They sang songs of their victories, but the songs were hollow. The wind carried the whispers of the dryads, and the rain washed the blood of the trolls into the rivers. The humans did not hear them. They were too loud, too busy, too blind. They thought they had won. They thought the war was over. But the war was not over. It had just changed. It was no longer a war of armies. It was a war of memory, and the elder races had a long memory. They remembered the names of the kings who had fallen. They remembered the faces of the children who had died. They remembered the taste of the ash that had choked their cities, and they would not forget. They would wait. They would hide. They would survive. And one day the humans would remember. One day the ghosts would return. The first true Witcher was not born in a cave or a forest, but in a laboratory that smelled of burnt herbs and boiled metal. The place was Aretuza, though not the grand academy of mages that would later rise from its ashes, but a smaller, private workshop tucked away in the city of Thanid. Ulzer, the mage, stood before a table that had seen better days, his fingers stained with a mixture of mercury and something far darker. He was not a man of patience, nor was he a man of mercy. He was a man of solutions. The world was overrun by monsters that no sword could stop, and the mages were too few to clear the roads. Ulzer wanted a machine that could walk the earth and kill without asking for coin or prayer. He wanted a weapon that did not tire, a blade that did not hesitate. The subjects for his experiment were not volunteers. They were orphans, boys stolen from the streets of Vizima or taken from the villages where the war had left them alone. They were hungry, cold, and terrified. Ulzer called them candidates. He treated them with the same clinical detachment one might show to a broken clock or a faulty lever. He believed that if he could strip away the fear, the pain, and the hesitation, he would be left with the pure essence of a hunter. He did not understand that fear was the only thing that made a man human. He thought he could engineer it out. The process began with the alchemy. Ulzer mixed the mutagens in a copper cauldron that sat over a fire fed by dried roots and animal fat. The fumes rose in thick, green ribbons, curling around the faces of the boys who were strapped to the iron tables. They screamed, but the sound was muffled by the thick leather pads Ulzer had placed over their mouths. The first boy to undergo the procedure was named Eamon. He was 12 years old and had a scar on his left cheek from a fall off a barn roof. He looked at Ulzer with wide, wet eyes and asked if his mother would be waiting when it was done. Ulzer did not answer. He simply nodded to his assistants, who held the ladles of boiling liquid. The potion was poured down Eamon's throat. The boy convulsed immediately. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, then black as the mutations took hold. His bones cracked and reshaped themselves with the sound of snapping twigs. His eyes, once brown, shifted to a milky white, the pupils dilating until the iris was a thin, trembling ring. The pain was absolute. It was a fire that burned from the inside out, consuming muscle and nerve. Eamon thrashed against the straps, his fingers tearing the leather, but the iron held firm. He died 3 times before he woke up. When he opened his eyes, he did not see the room. He did not see Ulzer. He saw the shapes of monsters in the corners, the heat of blood in the air. He was no longer Eamon. He was something else, something made for killing. Ulzer was not satisfied. The boy had survived, but he was broken. His mind was a shattered mirror reflecting only the instincts of the hunt. He could not speak, he could not reason. He was a beast in the shape of a man. Ulzer called this a failure. He wanted a soldier, not a rabid dog. He adjusted the formula. He added more silver. He increased the dosage of the mutagens. He tried again and again and again. The table grew cold with the bodies of the dead. Some died in the first hour, their hearts giving out under the strain. Some died days later, their bodies rejecting the changes. The workshop became a graveyard of children. The survivors were few. They sat in the corner of the room, huddled together for warmth, their eyes fixed on nothing. They did not speak. They did not eat. They waited for the command to kill. Ulzer looked at them with a mixture of triumph and disappointment. They were strong, faster than any human, their senses sharpened to a razor's edge. They could smell a ghoul's nest from a mile away. They could hear the heartbeat of a man hiding behind a wall. But they were empty. They had no culture. They had no history. They had no future. They were tools, nothing more. Ulzer realized then that his experiment was a mistake. He had created a monster to fight monsters, but in doing so he had created a new kind of horror. The boys were not the saviors he had envisioned. They were the victims. They were the living proof of his arrogance. He tried to fix them. He tried to teach them. He tried to give them names and rules, but the damage was done. The mutations had changed their very souls. They could not be unmade. One of the survivors, a boy named Geralt in a different life, or perhaps a boy named Lambert, sat on the floor and watched Ulzer work. He remembered the taste of the potion. He remembered the burning in his veins. He remembered the faces of the boys who had died beside him. He did not hate Ulzer. He did not feel anything at all. He only felt the urge to kill. It was a constant hunger, a void in his chest that nothing could fill. He looked at the mage and saw a shape that did not fit. A shape that was not a monster, but something worse. Something that made monsters. Ulzer eventually abandoned the workshop. He could not bear the sight of the boys. He could not bear the smell of the blood that had soaked into the floorboards. He locked the doors and walked away, leaving the survivors to their fate. They wandered out into the night, alone and confused. They had no home. They had no family. They had no purpose other than to kill. They were the first Witchers, born of a failed experiment created by a man who thought he could play God. The world did not know about them at first. They moved through the shadows, hunting the beasts that haunted the forests. They were efficient. They were ruthless. They did not ask for gold. They did not ask for thanks. They just killed. The villagers saw them as demons. The mages saw them as abominations. The kings saw them as tools to be used. But the Witchers knew the truth. They knew they were the children of a mistake. They knew they were the living scars of a war that would never end. Years later, when the schools were formed, when the training grounds were built in the wilds of the north, the story of Ulzer's experiment was forgotten. The new Witchers were taught a different history. They were told they were chosen. They were told they were guardians. They were told they were something special. But the truth remained in the blood. It remained in the mutations. It remained in the hollow look in their eyes when they stared at a monster. They were not the heroes of the stories. They were the survivors of a nightmare. And they would carry that nightmare with them until the day they died. The legacy of Ulzer's failure was not the Witchers themselves. It was the fear that men held for them. It was the suspicion that they were not quite human. It was the whisper that they were devils in the making. The people of the continent looked at the Witchers and saw the monster they had created. They saw the price of their safety. They saw the cost of their peace, and they turned their backs. They called them names. They threw stones. They tried to kill them, but the Witchers did not care. They had nothing left to lose. They had already lost everything. In the end, Ulzur's experiment was a failure. He did not create the saviors he wanted. He created the outcasts. He created the lonely figures who walked the roads, alone and afraid. He created the men who killed monsters but were hated by men. He created a caste of people who were neither human nor monster, but something in between. And that was the true horror, not the monsters they killed, but the men who had made them. The world had asked for a weapon. It got a tragedy, and the tragedy would continue for generations. The Witchers would keep killing. The people would keep fearing, and the cycle would never break. The story of the Witchers began not with glory but with pain. It began with the screams of children in a dark room. It began with the smell of burning flesh and the taste of bitter potions. It began with a man who thought he could fix the world by breaking it, and that was the first lie of the Witchers. The rest of the story was just a cover-up. The truth was written in their blood. It was written in their eyes. It was written in the way they walked, alone into the dark. They were the children of a failed experiment, and they would never be free of it. The stone fortress rose from the northern mountains not as a palace of kings, but as a scar of granite against the gray sky. It stood in a valley where the wind cut sharp and cold, a place chosen for its isolation as much as its defensive potential. Letho of Gyuleta, a man whose face had been hardened by years of wandering and rejection, first laid eyes on the ruins of Kaer Morhen and saw not a ruin, but a necessity. The world would not let them live in cities, so they would build their own. The world would not let them rest, so they would build a place to wait. The castle was old, its foundations sunk deep into the bedrock by hands long turned to dust, but the new masters of the place were alive, and they were desperate. Vesemir arrived with a small caravan of horses and men, their armor battered and their faces set in lines of permanent fatigue. He did not speak of the glory of the past or the legends of the future. He spoke of roofs that needed mending and walls that needed reinforcing. He spoke of the cold that would bite through a man's ribs if the fire was not kept burning. The first task was not the training of children, but the survival of the founders. They cleared the snow from the courtyard with iron shovels. They hauled water from the frozen stream below the cliffs. They patched the thatch on the lower barracks with tar and straw. There was no fanfare when the first door was fitted into the main gate. There was only the sound of the latch clicking shut, sealing them in against the winter. Inside, the halls were vast and empty, echoing with the footsteps of men who had nowhere else to go. The great fireplace in the center of the hall was the heart of the place, a roaring pit of wood and coal that kept the frost from the bones. Around it, the Witchers gathered in silence, their eyes red from the smoke and the strain of the day's labor. They did not laugh. They did not tell stories of old battles. They sat and they watched the fire, checking their swords, sharpening their knives, and listening to the wind howl against the stone. The silence was not a mood. It was a tool. It allowed them to hear the creak of a floorboard or the shift of a shadow. It allowed them to hear the boy who would come later. The first children arrived not in a procession but in the quiet of a storm. They were brought by men who had no love for them, only a debt to pay. The law of surprise was a cruel thing, a trick of language that turned a father's gratitude into a son's doom. A village elder had saved a witcher's life, and the witcher had asked for what the elder did not know he had. The answer was a child. The child was Tomas, a boy of no more than 10 winters, with wide eyes and a fear that sat heavy in his chest. He was dragged from the mud of the road and into the warm stone of the keep. He looked at the tall men with their pale eyes and their cat-like pupils, and he did not see saviors. He saw monsters. Vesemir stood before the boy, his massive frame blocking the light of the hearth. He did not raise a hand to strike. He did not raise a voice to shout. He knelt, bringing his face level with the trembling child. "You are safe here," Vesemir said, his voice rough like gravel under a boot. "The monsters outside cannot find you. The men who hate us cannot find you. Only we are here." Tomas did not answer. He looked at the medallion hanging from Vesemir's neck, the wolf symbol etched in silver. He did not know it was a warning. He did not know it was a promise. He only knew he was trapped. The training began before the boy could even understand the words of the man who spoke to him. It was not the grand trials of the future, with their alchemical horrors and their surgical precision. It was the basics. The sword was heavy in a child's hand. The leather armor chafed the skin until it bled. The lessons were simple: stand, move, strike, kill. The masters did not care about the boy's feelings. They cared about the boy's survival. If he could not survive the sword, he would not survive the swamp. If he could not survive the swamp, he would die. And they could not afford to lose another life. Tomas watched the older boys, the ones who had been there for years. They moved with a fluid grace that made his own movements look clumsy. They did not speak much. They did not play. They practiced. They were preparing for the trial of the grasses, the moment when the potions would be forced into their veins and their bodies would be torn apart and remade. Tomas knew of this trial. He had heard the whispers in the night, the stories of the screams that echoed from the lower chambers. He was afraid. He was so afraid that he could not sleep. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the creaking of the wood. He wanted to run. He wanted to go back to the village, to his mother, to the life he had lost. Vesemir found him one night, shivering under a thin blanket. The old witcher did not speak of courage. He did not speak of duty. He sat on the edge of the cot and placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "It will hurt," Vesemir said, his voice low and steady. "It will hurt more than anything you have ever felt, but it will make you strong. It will make you one of us." Tomas looked up at the old man, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be one of you," he whispered. "I want to be a man." Vesemir did not smile. He did not have the luxury of a smile. "Then you will die," he said. "And we will not have you to train. We need you. The world needs you, even if the world does not know it." The days passed into weeks and the weeks into months. The castle grew warmer as the snow melted and the spring sun hit the stone. The children grew stronger, their muscles hardening under the strain of the sword, but the fear did not leave them. It only grew deeper, buried under layers of training and discipline. They were learning to kill, but they were not learning to live. They were learning to be weapons, and a weapon does not think. A weapon does not feel. A weapon only strikes. Then came the day of the first real test. It was not the trial of the grasses. It was the red swamp. The masters took the boys out of the safety of the walls and dropped them into the mud. They were given only their medallions and their wits. They were told to survive. Tomas looked at the green water, the rotting trees, the insects that buzzed in the heat. He saw the shadows moving in the reeds. He heard the croak of the frogs, the snap of a twig. He knew he was not alone. He knew the monsters were there. He knew he was prey. He ran. He did not think. He did not fight. He ran. And in the chaos of the swamp, in the mud that sucked at his boots, he was caught. A ghoul rose from the water, its jaws wide and its teeth yellow with decay. It did not hesitate. It did not speak. It struck. Tomas screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the swamp. The world went dark. The castle was far away. The fire was cold. The old man's promise was broken. The boy died in the mud, and the witchers returned to the stone walls, carrying the silence of the dead back with them. Kaer Morhen stood on, its walls unbroken, its hearth still burning. The tragedy of Tomas was not a surprise. It was the price. It was the cost of the experiment. The witchers had built a fortress to keep the world out, but they could not keep the monsters away. They could not keep the pain away. They could only teach the boys to endure it, and so the cycle continued. The boys came. The boys trained. The boys died, and the castle remained, a monument to the men who had tried to fix the world by breaking it, and the boys who had paid the price. The stone walls of Kaer Morhen held the memories of the dead and the ghosts of the living. The wind howled through the courtyard and the fire crackled in the hall. The witchers sat and waited for the next child. They had no other choice. The alchemist's fire burned with a pale, sickly blue that did not warm the skin. In the small, windowless chamber beneath the castle, the air tasted of copper and rotting moss. Here, the boys who had survived the initial selection faced their final gate. They were not yet witchers. They were merely children, trembling in their tunics, their eyes wide with a terror they could not name. The liquid waiting for them was not water. It was a mixture of distilled nightshade, ground toadstools, and the boiled marrow of a griffin, thick as oil and green as a grave. Virgil of Ban-Ard, a mage who had watched the experiments with a scholar's detached gaze, once noted that the common folk believed these mutants were born of evil. He was wrong. The evil was not in the blood. It was in the choice to drink, the choice to feel the fire crawl under the skin and rewrite the very architecture of the body. The boys did not drink out of curiosity. They drank because the alternative was death by the blade or death by the swamp. One boy, whose name is lost to the ledgers of Kaer Morhen, stood before the cauldron. He was small, with a scar running down his left cheek. He looked at the bubbling brew, then at the steel doors that would seal him in for the duration of the agony. He wanted his mother. He wanted the soft bed of a village cot. He wanted the sun on his face. But he saw the monster in the corner of the room, the one the others had already slain, and he knew what came next if he refused. The potion would turn his bones to iron. It would sharpen his sight until the stars looked like burning nails. It would steal his ability to love, or perhaps just his ability to fear. He lifted the cup. His hand shook, but he drank. The taste was of ash and bile. It burned his throat and pooled in his stomach like liquid fire. He fell to his knees, convulsing as the magic tore through his veins. He screamed, a sound that echoed off the damp stone walls, but the alchemists did not stop. They watched. They recorded. They waited to see if the human would survive the transformation into something else. The process was not gentle. It was a violent unmaking. The skin blistered and peeled. The eyes shifted, the pupils splitting into vertical slits. The boy gasped for air that his new lungs could not find. When the fever broke 3 days later, the boy was different. He stood taller. His movements were fluid, unnatural. He looked at his hands, expecting them to be the hands of a child, but they were the hands of a weapon. He had survived the trial of the grasses. The pain was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow clarity. He was no longer a victim of the world. He was a hunter of it. The other boys who had survived would soon follow his path, their humanity stripped away to make room for the steel within. The fortress remained, the fire burned, and the cycle of mutation continued, turning the weak into the strong and the strong into the necessary. And so the Witchers waited, their bodies changed, their minds sharpened, ready to walk out into the dark and do what the world could not do for itself. The story of the swamp and the dead boy was over, but the work of the castle had only just begun. The first true Witcher was not born in a cave or a forest, but in a laboratory that smelled of burnt herbs and boiled metal. The place was Aretusa, though not the grand academy of mages that would later rise. It was a workshop of desperate men who understood that the world had turned against them. The monsters had grown bolder, no longer hiding in the deep woods, but stalking the edges of villages, dragging livestock into the night and leaving only bone behind. The villages called for help, and the kings called for soldiers. The soldiers came with pikes and shields, and they died. The knights came with mail and swords, and they died. The priests came with prayers and holy water, and the monsters laughed. It was a time when the natural order had fractured, and the creatures that once served as a reminder of the wild now served as a weapon against civilization. The first conflict did not have a name in the annals of history. There were no banners raised, no declarations of war read from castle walls. It was a slow, grinding attrition that took place in the mud of Velen and the fog of the swamps. Men called it the Great Cleansing, but that was a lie told by survivors to make sense of the slaughter. It was simply the war for survival. The Witchers walked into the breach where the armies had failed. They did not wear the shining plate of a knight, nor the robes of a mage. They wore leather and chain, and they carried swords that gleamed with a pale, unnatural light. These were the silver blades, forged to cut flesh that would not bleed like a man's. One of the first to take the field was a man named Vesemir, though at that time he was just another boy who had survived the alchemical trials. He stood on the ridge overlooking the village of Downwarren. The smoke from the thatched roofs had already begun to rise, a thick gray column against the twilight. Below, a pack of werewolves was tearing through the market square. They moved with a fluid grace that terrified the dogs, which had fled hours ago. Vesemir did not feel fear. The alchemists had stripped that away, along with the ability to feel the cold or the hunger. He felt only the calculation. He counted the beasts. He noted their positions. He watched the way the lead wolf twitched its ear toward the sound of a child crying in a cellar. He drew his steel sword first, for the wolves were not yet mutated enough to require silver. He leaped from the ridge, landing in the muck of the street with a heavy thud that silenced the dogs. The wolves turned as one, their yellow eyes locking onto the new threat. Vesemir moved before they could snarl. His sword was a blur, severing a spine, then a throat. He did not fight with rage, he fought with the efficiency of a butcher. The blood sprayed across his face, warm and thick, but he did not blink. He knew the cost of hesitation. He knew that if he missed once, he would die. He knew that if he died, the village would burn. The battle lasted minutes, but it felt like hours to the few survivors who watched from the windows. When the last wolf fell, its jaws still snapping at the empty air, Vesemir stood alone in the center of the carnage. He wiped his blade on the fur of the dead beast and looked toward the burning house. The people came out then, trembling, holding pitchforks and kitchen knives. They did not cheer. They stared at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror. To them, he was a monster who had killed monsters. He was a thing of the same blood as the beasts he had slain, only dressed in armor. A woman dropped her child into a cart and ran away from him, as if his presence would summon more wolves. This was the price of the war. The Witchers were the solution, but they were also the problem. They were the only ones who could fight the beasts, but they were also the reason the people could not sleep. The line between protector and predator had become thin, almost invisible. The kings began to hire them in greater numbers. The nobles offered them gold and land, but the Witchers took little. They took coin, but they did not take names. They took jobs, but they did not take credit. They were a secret weapon, a dirty secret that the realms kept hidden from the public eye. The war spread. It moved from the swamps to the mountains of Skellige, where the trolls were waking from centuries of sleep. It moved to the forests of Temeria, where the Leshens were driving whole families into the rivers. The Witchers followed. They were everywhere and nowhere. They left no graves for the dead, for they buried the monsters in the deep earth. They left no monuments, for the people who survived did not want to remember. They wanted to forget. They wanted to believe that the war was over, that the monsters had been driven back. But the Witchers knew better. They knew that the monsters were not defeated. They were only waiting. One winter, a Witcher named Lambert stood in the snow outside the walls of Oxenford. He had just returned from a hunt in the nearby woods where he had killed a griffin that had been terrorizing the trade routes. The griffin was dead, its massive wings folded against its body, its beak broken. Lambert looked at the body and felt nothing. He did not feel the triumph of a hunter who had taken a prize. He did not feel the satisfaction of a job well done. He felt the cold. He felt the numbness that the mutations had given him. He looked at his hands, which were calloused and scarred, and he wondered if he was still human. He remembered the words of an old alchemist who had trained him. "You are not a man," the man had said, his voice shaking with a mixture of awe and horror. "You are a tool, and a tool does not feel. A tool does not fear. A tool does not die." Lambert had laughed then, a dry, rasping sound. He had not laughed since. He had become the tool. He had become the weapon. And the weapon had been used again and again until it was worn down to the hilt. The war changed the world. It changed the people who fought it and the people who watched it. It changed the kings who began to see the Witchers as a necessary evil. It changed the mages who saw the Witchers as a perversion of their art. It changed the monsters who learned to fear the silver blades. But the Witchers themselves did not change. They remained the same, cold and hollow, walking through the fire and the ice, doing what the world could not do for itself. They were the first Witchers, the ones who started it all. They were the ones who proved that a man could be turned into a monster to fight the monsters. and they were the ones who paid the price. The first Witcher Wars ended not with a treaty but with a silence. The monsters retreated into the deep places where the light could not reach them. The villages rebuilt their homes. The trade routes reopened. The kings raised new armies. The Witchers disappeared into the shadows, waiting for the next call. They were the ghosts of the war, the ones who had saved the world but could not live in it. They were the ones who had walked out of the dark and into the light, only to find that the light was not enough. They were the ones who had become the hunter, and in doing so they had lost the man. The war was over, but the hunt was just beginning. The Witchers had changed the world, and the world had changed them. And so they waited, their swords at their sides, their eyes watching the horizon, ready for the next monster to rise. The dust of Marnadel still coated the wheels of the carriages when Queen Callanth ordered the retreat to the city. The road to Cintra was a river of mud and blood, choked by the dead horses of the vanguard and the wounded nobles who could no longer ride. The Nilfgaardian cavalry had shattered the northern flank with terrifying efficiency, and now they swept behind the fleeing column, cutting off the stragglers with cold precision. Callanth sat in a litter carried by 4 men whose breath came in ragged gasps, her face masked by a white cloth that had long since turned the color of dried rust. She had taken a spear through the shoulder during the initial clash, a wound that bled freely and refused to clot. She did not weep. She did not complain. She simply gripped the hilt of her dagger, her knuckles white, and stared ahead at the silhouette of her capital. The city that had been her home for 60 years, the jewel of the southern coast, now waited with its gates closed and its walls manned by a handful of terrified guards. The siege began the moment the first Nilfgaardian soldier stepped onto the drawbridge. There was no need for trebuchets to pound the stone into rubble, no need for starvation to break the spirit of the defenders. The army of the Empire was too close, too fresh, and too eager for the spoils of the north. The defenders of Cintra were not an army. They were a funeral procession that had barricaded itself inside a tomb. The gates were reinforced iron and oak, but they were no match for the fire that the Nilfgaardian sorcerers summoned. The magic did not roar. It hissed, a sharp, wet sound that tore through the air before the gates glowed cherry red and then collapsed inward. The defenders threw themselves against the breach, swinging swords that looked like toys against the disciplined ranks of the Empire. They died in the moat, their bodies piling up in the mud, blocking the flow of water and blood alike. Inside the inner keep, the atmosphere was not one of heroic defiance, but of absolute crushing finality. Queen Callanth had been carried into the central tower, her leg now broken from the fall during the retreat. The nobles of Cintra gathered around her, their faces pale, their fine clothes stained with the grime of the battle. They spoke of strategy, of holding the walls, of a desperate last stand, but their voices lacked conviction. They knew the truth. The city was already lost. The Nilfgaardian infantry was pouring through the outer wards, slaughtering the remaining guards with a methodical cruelty that left no room for escape. The enchanted inner keep was a fortress of illusion and steel, but it could not hold forever against a force that cared nothing for the cost. Cahir Mawr Diffrin Eep Sealatch stood on the ramparts overlooking the chaos below. He wore the black armor of the Imperial Knights, the silver crest of the Empire gleaming on his shoulder. He was not there to cheer for the victory. He was there to hunt. His orders were specific, and they concerned a child who should have been dead. He watched the Nilfgaardian soldiers drag the bodies of the nobility from the streets, their faces masks of triumph and bloodlust. He saw the women screaming, the men begging for mercy that would not come. The slaughter was not a battle, it was an execution. Cahir moved away from the edge, his boots silent on the stone, and began his descent into the lower levels of the keep. He had a name to find. He had a destiny to secure. The rest of the city could burn. That did not matter to him. Inside the tower, the queen sat upon a simple wooden stool, her back straight despite the agony that racked her body. Her daughter, Queen Pavetta, stood by her side, her face streaked with tears and soot. The girl was trembling, her hands clutching the hilt of a sword she could not wield. Callanth looked at her granddaughter, Ciri, who stood near the window, staring out at the smoke rising from the lower city. The child did not understand the scale of the horror yet, but she felt the weight of the moment. She knew that the world she knew was ending. Callanth spoke, her voice raspy from the wound in her throat. "There is no honor in dying here, Ciri," she said. "Only shame. We must not let them take you alive." The girl looked at her grandmother, her eyes wide with a fear that was older than her years. "Grandmother," she whispered, "where will we go?" The queen did not answer. She could not. There was no place to go. The Nilfgaardian forces breached the inner courtyard. The sound of clashing steel grew louder, the screams of the dying filling the air. The sorcerers had cracked the final wards, and the defenders were being cut down in the corridors. The nobles began to kill their own families. It was a mercy, they said, a final act of love to spare them the humiliation of captivity. Wives killed their husbands, mothers killed their children. The sound of the steel was sharp and quick, a terrible rhythm that echoed through the stone halls. The women of Cintra, seeing the men fall, turned their blades on their own offspring before ending their own lives. The tower became a chamber of the dead, a place where the air was thick with the smell of copper and the final breaths of a kingdom. Callanth watched her people die. She saw the nobles, the ones who had bowed to her, the ones who had sworn to protect her, now lying in piles of their own blood. She looked at Ciri, who was hiding behind her, shaking. The queen knew that the end was upon them. The doors to the tower would break within the hour. The Nilfgaardian soldiers would enter, and they would take the child. They would take her to the emperor, and she would be a pawn in a game she did not understand. Callanth could not allow that. She could not let her granddaughter suffer the fate of the others. She stood up, ignoring the pain in her leg, and walked to the window. The view was a panorama of ruin. The city of Cintra was burning, the flames licking at the sky, casting long, dancing shadows across the rubble. "Grandmother," Ciri cried, reaching for her hand, "do not go." Callanth turned, her face serene, her eyes hard. "I must," she said. "The world must not remember us as cowards." She looked at the nobles, at the dead, at the child. "If I stay, they will take you. If I die, they will remember me as a queen who refused to kneel." She stepped to the edge of the parapet. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of smoke and ash. Below, the courtyard was a sea of fire and blood. The Nilfgaardian soldiers were climbing the stairs, their armor clanking. Callanth did not hesitate. She did not pray. She did not look back. She threw herself from the tower, her body falling through the air, a silhouette against the burning sky. She hit the stone with a sickening crack, her life ending in an instant. The Nilfgaardian soldiers reached the tower moments later. They found the queen's body in the courtyard, her crown still upon her head. They found the nobles dead, their families dead, the women and children slaughtered in the final act of defiance. They found the child, Ciri, hiding in the shadows, trembling. But they did not find her for long. Cahir Mawr Diffrin Eep Sealach was there. He had arrived just in time. He did not speak to the soldiers. He did not explain. He simply took the child, wrapped her in his cloak, and vanished into the chaos of the burning city. The Nilfgaardian officers shouted, ordering their men to search to find the girl, but Cahir was already gone. He had saved her, not out of kindness, but out of duty. He had saved the future, even if it meant betraying the present. The city of Sintra was razed completely. The soldiers looted the houses, burned the libraries, and desecrated the tombs. The streets ran with blood, and the sky was choked with smoke. The people of the north would remember this day as the slaughter of Sintra. They would speak of the cruelty of the empire, of the madness of the queen, of the death of a kingdom. They would say that the girl died with her grandmother, that she leaped from the tower to her death. They were wrong. The girl lived. She lived because a man in black armor had made a choice. She lived because the hunt had begun. The war was not over. It had only just started. The north would burn, but the fire would not consume everything. Some things survived. Some things waited. And the child, the one with the eyes of the lion, would grow up to become the storm that would eventually break the empire. But that was a story for another time. For now, the only sound was the crackle of the flames and the silence of the dead. The wind on the sodden plateau carried the smell of wet earth and the metallic tang of fear. It swept across the boundless, undulating fields, turning the lush grass into a sea of green that stretched to the horizon. In the distance, the flat-topped hill stood like a crown against the gray sky. 14 figures waited upon that crown, their robes stiff with the damp of the morning. They were the mages of the northern realms, the last barrier between the empire and the heart of the continent. Below them, the Nilfgaardian army stretched out in a terrifying line, a sea of red cloaks and polished steel that seemed to have no end. Field Marshal Coehorn sat his horse at the edge of the formation, his face a mask of cold calculation. He did not fear the mages. He knew their power was finite, a candle flame against a gale. The northern forces had gathered in the valley, a ragged coalition of men from Redania, Temeria, and Edirn. They looked up at the hill with desperate hope. They believed the mages could stop the army without a single sword being drawn. They were wrong. The mages knew better, but they had no choice. They had to buy time, to break the enemy's momentum before the infantry could charge the hill. The first spell broke the air like a whip crack. A bolt of white lightning tore from the tip of a staff, striking the front line of the Nilfgaardian cavalry. Horses screamed as they collapsed, riders thrown into the mud. The second bolt followed, then the third. The mages worked in a rhythm, a chaotic symphony of will and force. They were not fighting for glory. They were fighting for survival. Triss Merigold stood near the center of the group, her hands trembling slightly as she raised her staff. She felt the heat of the spells radiating from her companions, a physical pressure against her skin. She had come to this hill because she believed in the cause, because she believed the North could be saved. She did not know that she would be counted among the dead. She only knew that she had to push harder. A Nilfgaardian archer, hidden in the smoke, loosed an arrow. It struck her in the shoulder, spinning her around. She bit back a cry, forcing her will to reignite the fire in her palm. The arrow burned away before it could pierce deeper. She was not invincible, but she was necessary. The battle raged for hours. The mages threw fire, ice, and lightning into the ranks of the Empire. They created walls of force to hold back the advancing infantry. They summoned storms to blind the enemy. The ground beneath the hill became a charred wasteland, the grass blackened and smoking. The smell of ozone and burning flesh filled the air. Coehorn watched the spectacle with a frown. He had expected a quick victory, but the mages were fighting with a ferocity that surprised him. He ordered his men to advance to close the distance. The infantry moved forward, shields locked, ignoring the falling fire. They were disciplined, trained to withstand the arcane. The mages began to falter. The strain of maintaining such powerful spells was immense. One by one, they dropped to their knees. Their magic was a river that could be dammed, but it could also run dry. A bolt of red energy from a Nilfgaardian mage struck the northern line. It hit a young sorcerer from Temeria, blowing him apart. His body was scattered across the grass, his staff rolling into the mud. The remaining mages shouted a warning, a desperate plea for the infantry below to retreat. But the men in the valley could not hear them over the roar of the battle. They saw only the mages holding the line, and they pressed forward, believing in the miracle. The end came quickly. Coehorn saw the opening. He ordered the charge. The cavalry surged forward, a wave of steel and blood. The mages threw everything they had left. A massive sphere of fire erupted from the center of the hill, engulfing 100 men and horses. But it was too late. The mages were exhausted. Their shields flickered and failed. The first Nilfgaardian soldier reached the top of the hill. He drove his sword into the back of a mage who was too tired to cast a shield. The second soldier struck another. The third, the fourth. It was a massacre. The mages fought until they could not stand, until their hands were too numb to hold their staffs. 14 names would be carved into the stone obelisk that would later rise on the hill. 14 graves, though only 13 bodies would be found. Triss Marigold lay in the mud, her vision blurred by blood and smoke. She could not move her legs. The fire was dying down. The sounds of the battle were fading into a dull roar. She thought of the girl in Sintra, the one with the eyes of a lion. She hoped she was safe. She hoped she had escaped. Then the darkness took her. She did not die. She survived, but she was broken. Her name would be written on the stone, a lie that would haunt her for years. She would walk the earth as a ghost among the living, remembered as one of the dead. The Nilfgaardian army claimed the hill. They raised their banners over the bodies of the mages. Coehorn dismounted, walking slowly through the carnage. He looked at the faces of the fallen mages, the men and women who had tried to stop him. He felt a strange respect for them. They had fought well. They had bought the North time. But time was a luxury the North could not afford. The war would continue. The North would fall. The mages had delayed the inevitable, but they could not stop it. Years later, a white-haired man would walk up the hill. He would look at the stone obelisk, his heart pounding in his chest. He would read the names carved into the stone. He would look for a specific name, the one that mattered most to him. He would see the name of Yael Grethen, a mage he did not know. He would let out a breath he had been holding for years. He would look at the other names at the grave of Triss Marigold. He would not know that she lived. He would only know that she was listed as dead. The wind would blow across the hill, carrying the scent of the grass and the memory of the fire. The fires of Bellatine would be lit each year, a tribute to the 14 who fell. But the truth of the matter would remain buried in the mud of the battlefield, known only to those who had survived. The North would remember the battle as a victory, a miraculous reprieve. They would forget the cost. They would forget that the mages had died so the soldiers could live. They would forget that the Empire was still waiting, still watching. The storm had not broken the Empire. It had only delayed the rain. The winter of the Bears' fall arrived not with a storm, but with a silence that settled over the Black Forest like a shroud of ash. The School of the Bear, once a bustling center of training and magic, stood empty. Its great stone halls, carved from the roots of ancient oaks, echoed only with the dripping of water and the scurrying of rats. The mages who had called it home were gone. Some had fled to the courts of men, others had vanished into the wilds, and the rest had simply ceased to exist. The Empire's agents had not come with fire and sword this time. They had come with patience. They had waited for the mages to scatter, for the school to weaken, and then they had struck. The end began in the lower chambers where the initiates slept. A boy named Kalen, barely old enough to shave, had been tasked with guarding the door to the library. He held a dagger in his hand, the steel cold against his palm. He did not fear the intruders. He feared the silence. The silence was wrong. It was not the quiet of sleep, but the quiet of a trap. He pressed his ear against the door and heard nothing but the settling of the stone. Then the door opened. It did not burst inward. It swung open slowly, as if pushed by a gentle hand. A man stood in the doorway. He wore the gray cloak of a Nilfgaardian captain. He held a sword, but it was not drawn. "Go," the captain said. His voice was low, almost kind. "Tell your masters we are here." Kalen did not run. He dropped the dagger and fell to his knees. He knew what came next. The mages of the Bear were not warriors. They were scholars, healers, and dreamers. They had spent their lives studying the stars and the flow of the ley lines. They had forgotten how to kill. The captain stepped into the room. Behind him, 2 more men entered. They carried no weapons. They carried sacks. The sacks were heavy. They contained salt and iron filings. The captain knelt beside Kalen. He did not strike the boy. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "The school is over," the captain said, "but you are not." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with a terror that had no name. The captain smiled, a thin, cruel thing. "You will live. You will remember, and you will tell them what you saw." Captain stood and walked away. The boy did not move. He watched as the men spread the salt and iron across the floor. They did not burn the school. They did not destroy the books. They simply left. The next morning, the sun rose over the Black Forest. The birds sang. The wind blew through the trees. But the school was dead. The magic that had flowed through its stones was gone. The ley lines that had once pulsed with life were now silent. The mages who had returned found only ruins. They found the bodies of their friends, their masters, their brothers. They found the books scattered, the scrolls burned, the alchemical vials shattered. They found the school empty. The School of the Bear had fallen. The mages had not fought. They had not tried to defend themselves. They had simply waited for the end. The Empire had won. The North was broken. The mages were scattered. The schools were closed. The world was changing. The age of the mages was over. The age of men was beginning. The survivors of the bear gathered in the ruins of the school. They stood in the courtyard, surrounded by the wreckage of their home. They did not speak. They did not cry. They simply looked at each other. They knew what they had to do. They had to leave. They had to scatter. They had to survive. The empire would not stop. It would not rest. It would not forget. The mages had to be ghosts. They had to be shadows. They had to be nothing. A woman named Alara stepped forward. She was old, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the scars of a long life. She had been a teacher at the school for 50 years. She had taught the mages who had died. She had taught the boy who had lived. She looked at the others. She saw the fear in their eyes. She saw the despair. She saw the hopelessness. She knew what they were thinking. They were thinking of the end. They were thinking of the death. They were thinking of the silence. "We are not dead," Alara said. Her voice was weak, but it carried. "We are not gone. We are hiding. We are waiting." She looked at the ruins. She saw the salt and iron on the ground. She saw the broken stones. She saw the fire that had not been lit. She knew the truth. The empire had not destroyed the school. They had simply removed the heart. The mages were the heart. Without them, the school was just stone. "We will return," Alara said. "One day when the time is right, when the empire is weak, when the north is strong again, we will return. We will rebuild. We will teach again. We will fight again." The others did not answer. They did not need to. They knew what she meant. They knew what they had to do. They had to live. They had to survive. They had to remember. The school of the bear was gone, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still waiting. They were still watching. The wind blew through the ruins. It carried the scent of ash and the memory of fire. The mages turned and walked away. They did not look back. They did not speak. They simply walked. They walked into the forest. They walked into the shadows. They walked into the night. The school of the bear was dead, but the mages were not. They were alive. They were hiding. They were waiting. The empire had won the battle, but the war was not over. The mages were still out there. They were still watching. They were still waiting. The north was broken, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still alive. They were still waiting. The age of the mages was over, but the war was not. The mages were still out there. They were still watching. They were still waiting. The north was broken, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still alive. They were still waiting. The wind blew through the ruins. It carried the scent of ash and the memory of fire. The mages turned and walked away. They did not look back. They did not speak. They simply walked. They walked into the forest. They walked into the shadows. They walked into the night. The school of the bear was dead, but the mages were not. They were alive. They were hiding. They were waiting. The empire had won the battle, but the war was not over. The mages were still out there. They were still watching. They were still waiting. The north was broken, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still alive. They were still waiting. The age of the mages was over, but the war was not. The mages were still out there. They were still watching. They were still waiting. The north was broken, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still alive. They were still waiting. The wind blew through the ruins. It carried the scent of ash and the memory of fire. The mages turned and walked away. They did not look back. They did not speak. They simply walked. They walked into the forest. They walked into the shadows. They walked into the night. The school of the bear was dead, But the mages were not. They were alive. They were hiding. They were waiting. The Empire had won the battle, but the war was not over. The mages were still out there. They were still watching. They were still waiting. The North was broken, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still alive. They were still waiting. The age of the mages was over, but the war was not. The mages were still out there. They were still watching. They were still waiting. The North was broken, but the mages were not. They were still there. They were still alive. They were still waiting. The gravel of the road to the Griffin School crunched under the boots of a boy who had not yet learned to kill. He walked with a limp, a souvenir from a fall that had broken his leg and nearly his spirit. This was Geralt, though he did not yet wear the name as a title. To the masters of the Griffin School, he was merely another charge, another vessel to be filled with alchemy and sharpened with steel. The school itself was a fortress of gray stone, perched high on a cliff where the wind howled with the ferocity of a wounded beast. It was a place of discipline, not of mercy. The training began before the sun fully crested the eastern ridge. The boys ran until their lungs burned, their breath pluming in the cold air. They sparred with wooden swords until their hands blistered and bled. There were no monsters in the courtyard, only the hard faces of their instructors. Master Visigoda, a man whose beard was as white as the winter snow and whose eyes held the cold calculation of a butcher, watched them all. He did not shout. He did not need to. His presence was enough to make the strongest among them tremble. He walked the line of boys, tapping his cane against the stone, correcting a stance, adjusting a grip. Geralt stood in the second row. He was taller than the others, his frame broadening in a way that suggested the mutations were already taking hold. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, once a deep brown, were shifting toward a strange, luminous yellow. He felt the change inside him, a burning in his blood that the alchemists called the trial of the grasses. It was a poison that should have killed him. Instead, it had rewritten him. He remembered the taste of the broth, the acrid bitterness that coated his tongue for days. He remembered the fever that made him see his mother's face in the smoke of the fire. He had wanted to scream, but his throat would not obey. The boy next to him, a small creature named Eskel, wiped sweat from his brow. Eskel was quick, faster than Geralt, but he lacked the raw power that the mutations had given his friend. They were partners in the training yard, two boys who had survived the trials together. Eskel looked at Geralt with a mixture of fear and admiration. He did not understand the changes in his friend, but he knew that Geralt was different. He knew that Geralt was becoming something else. "We will be ready," Eskel whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We will be ready for the monsters." Geralt did not answer. He was thinking of the stories the older boys told, the tales of the first witchers who had fought in the great wars of the past. They spoke of the School of the Wolf, a rival house that trained in the mountains of the north. They spoke of a time when the witchers were heroes, not outcasts. Geralt wondered if that time was truly gone. He wondered if he would ever be more than a weapon. The masters of the Griffin School did not care about such things. They cared only for results. They cared for the efficiency of the kill, the precision of the strike. They cared for the coin that the kings and queens would pay for their services. The school was a factory, and the boys were the product. They were to be sold to the highest bidder. sent to the edges of the world to clean up the messes of men. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Geralt stood alone in the courtyard. He held a silver sword, its blade gleaming in the fading light. He had been practicing a new form, a series of movements that required a level of speed and coordination that was beyond the reach of most men. He spun the sword, the metal singing in the air. He felt the weight of it, the balance, the way it seemed to become an extension of his own arm. He remembered the words of a story he had heard from an old traveler who had visited the school. The traveler had spoken of a witcher named Geralt, a man who had once been a child in the Griffin school. He had spoken of a woman named Yennefer, a sorceress of great power and beauty. He had spoken of a girl named Ciri, a child of destiny who was hunted by the forces of the north. The story had ended with the witcher and the sorceress standing together, ready to face whatever came next. Geralt shook his head, trying to clear the images from his mind. He knew that such stories were just that, stories. They were fairy tales for children, not the reality of the world. The world was a place of blood and fire, of death and destruction. It was a place where the witchers were the only ones who could stand between the monsters and the people. He sheathed his sword and walked back to the dormitory. The other boys were already asleep, their breathing heavy and slow. Geralt lay down on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the road ahead, the long and dangerous path that lay before him. He thought of the monsters he would have to kill, the people he would have to save. He thought of the price he would have to pay for his survival. The Griffin School was a place of pain, but it was also a place of purpose. It was a place where a boy could become a man, where a man could become a weapon. Geralt knew that he would never be the same again. He knew that the world would never be the same again, but he also knew that he had a duty to fulfill. He had a destiny to embrace. The wind howled outside, carrying the scent of the sea and the promise of storms. Geralt closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the wind. He knew that the wind would blow forever, and that he would walk with it until the end of his days. He knew that he was a witcher, and that he would never be free. But he also knew that he was alive, and that was enough. The years passed, and the boy grew into a man. The scars on his body became the marks of his trade, the signs of his survival. The yellow in his eyes became a permanent feature, a symbol of his otherness. The Griffin School became a memory, a distant echo in the back of his mind. But the lessons he had learned there, the discipline, the skill, the pain, they remained with him. They were the foundation of his life, the bedrock of his existence. He left the school with nothing but the clothes on his back and the sword at his side. He had no home, no family, no friends. He had only the road and the monsters that waited on it. He was a wanderer, a solitary figure in a world that feared him. But he was also a protector, a shield against the darkness. He was a witcher, and he would do what he had to do. The road stretched out before him, a ribbon of dust and stone that wound through the mountains and the forests. It was a road of danger, of death, of uncertainty. But it was also a road of freedom, of adventure, of discovery. Geralt took his first step, and then another, and then another. He walked into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next. The Griffin School was behind him, but the memories of it would never fade. They were a part of him, a part of his soul. They were the stories he would tell to the children who gathered around the fire, the tales of the witchers and the monsters, of the heroes and the villains. They were the stories that would be told for generations, the legends of the Witcher. Geralt walked on, the wind at his back, the stars above. He was alone, but he was not lonely. He was a Witcher, and he had a purpose. He had a destiny, and he would fulfill it no matter the cost. The road was long, and the journey was just beginning. The stone of Thanid Island rose from the sea like a jagged tooth, a stark white monument against the gray of the June sky. It was not a place of refuge, but a stage for a final, terrible performance. On June 30th, the Grand Mage's conclave had drawn the Brotherhood together, a gathering of the chapter of the gift and the art that promised unity but delivered fracture. The air inside the main hall smelled of roasted meat, spiced wine, and the ozone tang of contained power. Mages from the north and the south stood shoulder to shoulder, exchanging pleasantries that masked a war already fought in the shadows of their minds. Philippa Eilhart moved through the crowd with the grace of a woman who knew exactly where every footstep would land. She wore a gown of deep violet, the fabric heavy and rich, but her eyes were cold, scanning the room for the faces she needed to find. She had learned of the Nilfgaardian plot before the first wine cup was raised. The betrayal was not a surprise. It was a calculation. She had spent the night not in sleep, but in the quiet, feverish work of planning a counter-strike. She knew that Vilgefortz, Terra Nova, and Francesca Findabair would not wait for the morning. They would strike the moment the sun touched the horizon, using the chaos to seize control of the north. Philippa decided to let them make the first move, but only to ensure their failure was absolute. The night passed with a deceptive calm. The mages retired to their quarters, some to rest, others to guard their secrets. But while the island slept, the northern supporters did not. They moved through the corridors with the silence of ghosts, their faces set in masks of grim determination. Before the dawn broke over the sea, they had already secured the inner sanctum. The arrests were swift and brutal. Vilgefortz was dragged from his chambers, his hands bound in chains of silver and lead that sapped his strength. Terra Nova was taken next, and then Francesca, her protests cut short by the hard reality of a spell that silenced the air around her. By the time the first light touched the eastern wall, the Nilfgaardian faction was in chains, led out of the tower by Philippa's loyalists. The Council of Mages, the five who held the lower chamber's authority, found themselves split by the blade of circumstance. Carduin and Yennefer had tried to remain neutral, standing apart from the rising tide of violence, hoping that reason might yet prevail. Furkart, however, had made his choice long before the sun rose. He stood with the Nilfgaardians, his loyalty bound to the Emperor rather than the Brotherhood. Radcliffe and Philippa, on the other hand, had chosen the North, believing that the survival of their home required the destruction of the Southern Alliance. The unity of the Council was a lie that had finally been exposed. The prisoners were transported to Garstang, a small coastal town that would become the graveyard of the Brotherhood's honor. The trial was meant to be quick, a summary judgment to end the threat before it could spread. Tissia de Vries arrived to find her fellow mages shackled and humiliated. She saw Vilgefortz, a man she had once respected, stripped of his dignity. She saw the cruelty in the eyes of those who held the chains. Tissaia felt a cold rage settle in her chest. This was not justice. It was a slaughter dressed in the robes of law. Philippa met her gaze and spoke the truth. She explained the deceit, the plans to overthrow the northern kings and sell them to Nilfgaard. But Tissaia saw the hypocrisy in the northern response. The methods were the same, only the side had changed. They were no better than the men they claimed to fight. Tissaia looked at Ciri, the young girl who stood nearby, her mind open to the truth of the matter. The child saw the blood that stained the floor, the fear in the eyes of the captives, and the greed in the hearts of the captors. Tissaia realized that the barrier of magic surrounding Garstang was not a shield, but a cage. It trapped them all in a room where violence was the only language spoken. She made her decision then. She reached out with her mind and tore down the magical barrier. The air rushed in, carrying the smell of salt and the cry of gulls. She hoped for a civil outcome, a moment where the mages might lower their hands and speak as men and women, not as soldiers. She wanted the blood to stop flowing. But the Nilfgaardian supporters, freed by the sudden collapse of the barrier, did not wait for peace. They saw an opportunity and seized it with the ferocity of starving wolves. The attack was instantaneous. Spells of fire and ice erupted from the crowd, turning the square into a battlefield. The Nilfgaardians, led by Vilgefortz, unleashed a storm of destruction. The northern mages fought back with equal fury. The air filled with the screams of the dying and the crack of shattered stone. It was a massacre, not a battle. The neutrality of Carduin and Yennefer offered no protection in the chaos. They were caught in the crossfire, their magic turned against them. Radcliffe fell first, struck down by a bolt of energy that burned through his chest. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock before collapsing into the dust. Philippa screamed his name, but the sound was lost in the roar of the conflict. She fought with a desperation that bordered on madness, her spells tearing through the air, but she could not stop the tide. The council was broken. The five who had sat together in the grand hall were now scattered, dead, or fleeing for their lives. Furkart did not survive the day. He was found later, his body burned beyond recognition, a final testament to the price of his loyalty. The fall of the council was not just a political defeat, it was the end of an era. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, once a pillar of stability in the world, was now a fractured remnant. Many of the survivors fled north, seeking refuge in Redania, Kaedwen, Kovir, and Hengfors. They carried with them the weight of their failure, the knowledge that they had destroyed their own order. Yennefer stood amidst the ruins of Garstang, her face streaked with soot and blood. She looked at the bodies of her friends, the men and women who had once been her peers. She thought of the words they had spoken in the hall, the promises of unity and peace. Those words were now nothing but ash. She had survived, but at what cost? The world had changed, and the magic that had once bound it together was now a weapon in the hands of the desperate. The sun set over the sea, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a grave. The mages who had gathered to discuss the future of the world had only succeeded in ensuring its destruction. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and betrayal. But for those who survived, there was no turning back. They had to face the consequences of their actions, the blood on their hands, and the truth that they had lost something precious that day. The story of Thanid would be told in the taverns and the courts, but it would be a story of failure. The Council of Mages was gone, and with it, the dream of a united brotherhood. The world would remember the day the mages turned on each other, the day the magic that was meant to protect became the instrument of death. And in the quiet moments when the wind blew through the ruins of Garstang, the ghosts of the fallen would whisper their regrets, hoping that one day the world might learn from their mistake. But until then, the road stretched out, dark and uncertain, leading only to more blood and more loss. The mages who survived walked away, each carrying a piece of the shattered council in their hearts, a reminder of the day they lost everything. Geralt of Rivia stood on the edge of the forest that bordered the Velen swamps, his boots sinking into mud that had seen too many armies pass. The air smelled of wet rot and burning wood, a stench that clung to the wool of his tunic and settled deep in his lungs. He was not hunting monsters that night. He was hunting a child. The law of surprise, a debt paid in a banquet hall years ago with wine and oaths, had finally come due. It had taken a decade for the thread of that promise to lead him here, to a place where the trees grew twisted and the ground seemed to shift underfoot. He had walked from the northern borders to the southern marshes, crossing rivers that ran red with blood and villages that stood empty, their doors hanging open like broken jaws. The girl was named Cyrilla, though he knew her only as Ciri, a name whispered by a queen who had died in a fire. She was the child of Dunny, the man who had been a monster and then an emperor, and Pavetta, the woman whose power had torn a room apart with a scream. Geralt did not care about empires or prophecies written in ancient scrolls. He cared for the blood of his own making, the life that had been claimed by a coin toss and a father's gratitude. He had told himself he would not take her, that the law was a formality, a ritual to satisfy a conscience. But the world had changed. The mages were dead, the brotherhood was scattered, and the girl was the only thing left that belonged to him. He remembered the night in Sintra, the taste of the wine, the way Pavetta's hands had trembled as she realized she was with child. Dunny had looked at him then, his eyes dark with a fear he could not hide. "I owe you my life," Dunny had said, his voice rough. "I cannot start a new life in the shadow of a life debt." Geralt had shaken his head, dismissing the offer, but the insistence had been too great. "The law of surprise," Geralt had said, the words tasting like ash. "I claim what you have but do not know." The silence that followed had been heavy, broken only by Pavetta's sudden retching, a physical sign of the child growing inside her. He had left them then, a white wolf returning to the wild, believing the debt was settled. Now the debt was a ghost that haunted his every step. He had seen the signs of her passage long before he reached the swamps. A broken branch snapped at shoulder height, a trail of fresh blood on a fern, a small boot print pressed into the soft earth. She was running. She was being hunted. The wild hunt, the ghosts of the dead riding on spectral horses, sought her for the power that slept in her veins. The Nilfgaardians wanted her for the prophecy that claimed she would end the world or save it. Everyone wanted a piece of her, and Geralt was the only one who wanted her safe. He found the first body 3 days into the swamp, a soldier in Nilfgaardian armor half-eaten by crocodiles. The man had been dead for hours, his face frozen in a final scream. Geralt knelt beside him, checking the pockets for clues, his fingers finding a map marked with a route that led north. He tucked the map into his belt and stood, looking at the tree line where the shadows were thickest. The girl was ahead, and she was terrified. He could feel it in the way the birds had stopped singing, in the way the wind died down as he approached the old mill. The mill stood on a small rise, its wheels stopped and rusted, a skeleton of wood against the gray sky. Inside he found no monsters, only the smell of fear and the sound of a girl crying softly in the corner. She was small, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her hair a mess of tangles that fell over her eyes. She held a wooden sword in her hands, a toy that looked too small for the task she faced. Geralt stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under his weight. She looked up, her eyes wide, and for a moment he saw Pavetta in her face, the same fierce intelligence, the same spark of danger. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. Geralt did not answer immediately. He looked at the wooden sword, then at the girl, and he saw the truth of it. She was not just a child. She was a weapon, a key to a door that should have remained closed. "I am your destiny," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He had never been a man of riddles, but the world had forced him to be one. "I am here to take you away." She did not understand. She did not know the weight of the name she carried, the blood that bound her to the past and the future. She only knew that the man with the white hair and the sword was the only thing standing between her and the dark. Geralt reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, and for a moment he hesitated. He thought of the woman he had loved, the one who had died in the fire, and he thought of the oath he had made. He could not leave her here. He could not let the world take her. "I will protect you," he said, his voice low. "I promise." She nodded, a small, jerky movement, and stepped toward him. The moment their hands touched, the air in the room seemed to shift, a sudden rush of power that made the hair on his arm stand up. It was the magic of the elder blood, the same force that had torn the room in Sintra apart. It was wild and untamed, and it frightened him. But he did not pull away. He held her hand tight, feeling the pulse of a life that was meant to be lost, now saved by a wolf who had no business saving anyone. They left the mill under the cover of darkness, moving through the swamp with the caution of prey. Geralt led the way, his senses alert to every sound, every shift in the wind. He knew the hunt was coming, that the Nilfgaardians would be on their trail. He did not know how long they would have or where they would go, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let them take her. The road ahead was long and dangerous, filled with death and betrayal, but he would walk it. He would carry her through the fire and the ice, through the shadows of the past and the light of the future. The law of surprise was not a debt to be paid. It was a bond to be kept. It was the reason he had returned, the reason he had walked the long road from the north to the south, from the safety of the wilds to the heart of the storm. He looked back at the girl walking beside him, her small face illuminated by the moonlight, and he felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost everything else, his home, his friends, his purpose, but he had found her. And for the first time in a long time, he knew what he was fighting for. The swamp stretched out before them, a sea of black water and twisted trees, but they did not stop. They walked on, two figures against the dark, bound by blood and fate. The world would burn, the kingdoms would fall, and the prophecies would come to pass, but they would walk through it all together. The wolf and the lioness, the hunter and the hunted, the past and the future, all bound by a single promise made in a banquet hall long ago. The road was dark, but they had a light to guide them. It was the light of a child's hope, and it was enough to keep the shadows at bay. Far to the north, beyond the reach of the White Wolf's road, the School of the Cat carved its name into the history of men rather than monsters. They did not hunt for survival in the wilds. They hunted for coin in the streets. Their fortress, a place of iron and cold stone, bred boys who learned to smile, while sharpening blades meant for throats. They were not guardians of the realm, but mercenaries who sold their mutations to the highest bidder, often finding that humans paid better than ghouls. Among them walked Jad Carradine, a boy whose eyes had already grown old before he reached the age of 20. He learned that a contract was a promise, and a promise could be bought, broken, or enforced with a dagger. Carradine and his band did not fear the dark. They wore it as a cloak. They took a job to collect a debt owed by a fellow witcher named Aidan, a man who had bungled a spell for a duke's daughter. The girl died, and the coin remained unpaid. Carradine remembered the confrontation in the cold light of a winter dawn. He remembered the tension in the air, the way the wind carried the scent of frozen blood. When the shot rang out, it was not the wind that took Aidan's life. It was a bolt from the shadows, fired by a girl named Vienne who lost her nerve at the wrong moment. Or so Carradine told himself later, as he sat in his warm estate in Novigrad, sipping wine and listening to the laughter of children who were not his own. Lambert, who stood by Aidan's side, offered a different truth. He claimed Carradine did not wait for the shot. He claimed the bloody Baron of the North stepped forward, mask off, and drove the blade into his brother's heart to silence a man who knew too much about the cost of their trade. The truth of that day matters less than the silence that followed. Carradine buried the Witcher in the mud of the North and walked south to become Roland Truger. He bought a ship, the Pearl of the Coast, and traded in live goods between Novigrad and Skellige. He donated gold to widows and orphans, building a reputation that sat heavy on his shoulders. He married a woman named Letisha, a woman who knew his secrets and prayed for his soul every night. Carradine believed his prayers kept him safe. He believed his new life was a shield against the past. He did not know that the past does not forgive and it does not forget. It only waits for the right moment to knock on the door of a respectable merchant. The road to Novigrad is long, and the storm that follows a hunter is not always the wind. The wolf has found the trail, and the trail leads to the man who wears the face of a philanthropist. Now, the journey turns toward the city where the cat hides among the men, and the debt of Aidan's blood is due. The bells of Vizima did not ring for prayer on that morning. They tolled for the end of a reign that had already begun to crumble. The city stood as a jewel in the crown of the northern kingdoms, a fortress of red brick and stone that had weathered 100 winters. It was a place of merchants, spies, and kings, a place where the air tasted of river silt and roasted meat. But the air also carried the scent of iron, the metallic tang of a sword drawn in the street. The northern realms, once a tapestry of alliances, were fraying at the edges. The Nilfgaardian threat was not a distant storm on the horizon anymore. It was the rain already soaking the cobblestones. King Foltest sat in his chambers, the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the light. He was a man who had spent his life calculating the odds of survival, a man who had survived the assassins, the lovers, and the political maneuverings of a dozen courts. He looked at the map spread across his desk, the red ink marking the borders of his kingdom. He knew the numbers. He knew that the Nilfgaardian legions were disciplined, equipped with steel that outshone the finest armor of the north. He knew that the alliance of the northern kings was a fiction, a fragile agreement held together by fear and the memory of Sintra. The slaughter of the Siri had broken the spirit of the realm, and now the hammer was falling again. The siege began not with a roar but with a whisper. The gates of Vizima were reinforced, the walls manned by men who had not seen battle in years. They were city guards, militia, and mercenaries, all gathered under the banner of the Lion of Sintra. They stood behind the stone ramparts, looking down at the plain where the enemy army gathered. The Nilfgaardian lines were a sea of red and black, a discipline that was terrifying to behold. There was no shouting, no charging. There was only the slow, methodical advance of siege engines, the grinding of wheels on dirt, the clinking of chain mail. Difflin, the general of the northern forces, stood on the battlements. He was a man of old blood, a veteran of the Battle of Sodden, a man who had seen the fire of the mages burn the earth. He watched the enemy with a cold eye, calculating the strength of the walls, the depth of the moat. He knew that the city could hold for a while, but he also knew that the northern kings would not send help. The fracture was already here, in the silence of the couriers, in the empty roads. The alliance was dead before the first arrow was fired. The first assault came on the third day. The Nilfgaardian mages, cloaked in the gray of their order, raised their hands. The air crackled with energy, a sound like tearing silk. A bolt of fire struck the western gate, the stone exploding in a shower of sparks. The defenders scrambled, shields raised, arrows loosed. The gate held, but the stone was cracked, the wood charred. The Nilfgaardian infantry surged forward, a wave of men who did not know fear. They climbed the ladders, their hands steady, their eyes fixed on the top of the wall. The fighting was brutal, a close-quarters slaughter that turned the ramparts into a slaughterhouse. The northern defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were the last line of defense. They used spears, swords, and crossbows, driving the enemy back into the mud. But the Nilfgaardian lines were endless. For every man who fell, two more took his place. The defenders were pushed back, step by bloody step, until they were fighting in the streets of the city itself. King Foltest watched the battle from the tower, his face pale. He knew that the city was falling. He knew that the northern realms were fractured, that the kings who had promised to send aid were too busy fighting their own wars. He knew that the only hope was a miracle that would not come. He thought of the children in the city, the women, the old men. He thought of the blood that would be spilled, the screams that would fill the night. He thought of the cost of his own ambition, the price of his own survival. The city fell on the seventh day. The walls were breached, the gates burned. The Nilfgaardian army poured into the streets, a tide of red and black that could not be stopped. The defenders fought to the last man, but they were overwhelmed. The king, his crown torn from his head, his sword broken, fled into the sewers. He was caught in the dark, his hands bound, his eyes filled with the terror of a man who knows his end is near. The aftermath was a silence that was louder than the battle. The city was in ruins, the streets filled with the dead. The Nilfgaardian soldiers looted the buildings, burned the homes, and took the survivors as slaves. The northern realms had lost their heart, their capital, their hope. The fracture was complete. The alliance was dead. The kings were divided and the north was broken. The story of Vizima became a legend, a warning to the future. It was a story of a city that fell because it stood alone. It was a story of a king who failed his people, of a general who could not save his army. It was a story of the cost of war, the price of ambition. The bells of Vizima were silent, the towers crumbled, and the city was forgotten. But the memory of the siege remained, a scar on the history of the northern realms. The Nilfgaardian victory was complete, but the war was not over. The northern kings, humiliated and defeated, would gather their forces again. They would fight again, they would die again. But the fracture would remain, a wound that would never heal. The north was broken, and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a reminder that the cost of war is paid in blood, and the price of victory is the soul of a nation. The road to the south was long, and the journey was filled with danger. The Nilfgaardian army marched on, leaving the ruins of Vizima behind. They carried the spoils of war, the gold, the slaves, the glory. But they also carried the memory of the battle, the cost of their victory. The north was broken, and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the north was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the north was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken, and the future was uncertain. The road to the south was long and the journey was filled with danger. The Nilfgaardian army marched on, leaving the ruins of Vizima behind. They carried the spoils of war, the gold, the slaves, the glory. But they also carried the memory of the battle, the cost of their victory. The north was broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the north was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken, and the future was uncertain. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the north was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the north was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken, and the future was uncertain. The plains of Brenna stretched out like a table of pale stone, waiting for the meal of the living to be poured upon it. It was a vast, open expanse where the wind swept unimpeded, carrying the scent of dry grass and the distant, metallic taste of iron in the air. No forests broke the line of sight, no hills offered cover, and no rivers could shield the flank. The northern armies had chosen this ground, a decision born of desperation and a misplaced faith in the power of their magic. They believed the open field would favor the combined might of their mages, a belief that would cost them dearly. The Nilfgaardian forces approached from the south, a dark tide of steel and leather that swallowed the horizon. They did not rush. They advanced with the methodical certainty of a clockwork mechanism, their ranks unbroken, their discipline absolute. King Foltest of Temeria stood upon the ridge, his armor polished to a dull sheen that reflected the gray sky. He held his sword with a grip that had long since turned his knuckles white, a habit formed in the years before he wore a crown. He looked out over the sea of men arrayed before him, a patchwork of banners from Edern, Temeria, Redania, and Keedwen. The colors clashed, a chaotic tapestry of blue, red, and gold, united only by the threat of the southern eagle. Foltest felt a familiar coldness settle in his gut, the same sensation he had known when he first drew blood in a tavern brawl, only magnified 1,000-fold. He whispered a prayer to a god he was not sure listened, asking for strength for the men who could not afford to be afraid. The king did not fear death. He feared the failure of the alliance, the return of the petty squabbles that had plagued the north for centuries. The battle began not with a charge, but with a roar of magic that shattered the morning quiet. The northern mages, gathered in a circle at the center of the line, unleashed a torrent of fire and lightning upon the Nilfgaardian vanguard. The sky turned a sickly yellow as the air crackled with raw power, and the ground beneath the enemy feet boiled. For a moment, it seemed the prophecy of the mages' supremacy was true. The Nilfgaardian lines wavered, soldiers dropping their shields as the heat blistered their skin. But the Emperor's forces were not easily broken. They had prepared for this. Behind the front lines, their own sorcerers raised shields of force, a shimmering wall of energy that absorbed the northern barrage and reflected it back with greater intensity. The mages of the north were not a single unit but a collection of individuals, each with their own agenda, their own pride. The spell faltered, the coordination broke, and the northern advantage evaporated in a cloud of ozone and ash. The Nilfgaardian cavalry surged forward, their heavy lances lowered. They crashed into the northern infantry with the force of a falling tree, shattering the lines of the Edurnian and Redanian soldiers. Men were thrown from their horses, trampled by hooves that knew no mercy. The sound of the battle was a cacophony of screaming metal, dying men, and the thunder of boots on hard earth. In the center, the mages fell back to a defensive position, casting spells that tore the air apart. But they were surrounded. The Nilfgaardian infantry moved with a precision that was terrifying to behold, flanking the mages and cutting off their retreat. They did not rush. They simply closed the circle, tightening the noose with every step. General Menno Coehorn watched the slaughter from his command post, his face a mask of cold calculation. He had studied the northern tactics, analyzed their movements, and predicted their every move. He knew that the mages were their weakness, not their strength. He had ordered his troops to ignore the initial magical assault and wait for the moment the northern lines faltered. That moment had arrived. Coehorn did not feel triumph. He felt only the satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. He gave a single order, a gesture of his hand that sent the final wave of his army forward. The northern forces, already reeling from the initial shock, began to break. The panic spread like a contagion, turning disciplined soldiers into a stampede of frightened men. The fall of the Northern Alliance was swift and brutal. The banners of the kingdoms were torn down, trampled into the mud. The gold of the crown was scattered, and the pride of the north was laid bare. The mages who had been the pride of the alliance were hunted down one by one. Some died fighting, their spells lighting up the sky in a final, desperate display of power. Others were taken alive, their hands bound, their faces covered in blood and ash. The Nilfgaardian soldiers did not take prisoners, they took trophies. The heads of the fallen mages were cut off and displayed on pikes, a grim reminder of the cost of defying the Empire. The battle was over in a matter of hours, but the aftermath would last for years. The plain of Brenna was a graveyard of broken dreams. The grass was soaked in blood, turning the green fields into a sea of red. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and the cries of the wounded. The northern survivors fled in all directions, their units scattered, their commanders dead or missing. The road to the north was open, and the Nilfgaardian army marched on, leaving the dead behind to the crows and the vultures. The north was broken, and the future was uncertain. The story of Brenna was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of the northern cities did not ring again. The cities were ghosts, memories of a time when the North was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the North was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the North was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The sun set over the plains of Brenna, casting long shadows over the dead. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and death. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the weight of the lives lost. The northern armies had been defeated and the path to the south was open. The Nilfgaardian victory was total, but the cost was high. The Empire had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The North was broken, but it would not stay broken forever. The seeds of resistance were already sown, and they would grow in the dark places of the world. The story of Brenna was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the world. The North would rise again, but the price would be paid in blood. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was long and dangerous. The bells of the northern cities would ring again, but they would ring for a different song. The song of the North was not one of unity. It was one of survival. The North would survive, but it would never be the same. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the North was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Vizima was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Vizima did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the North was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The sun over the ruins of Sintra did not rise on a city, but on a graveyard where the stones had been turned to ash, and the streets were paved with the broken bodies of those who had refused to flee. Queen Callanth had taken her own life in a final act of defiance, her body striking the cobblestones of the outer bailey with a sound that echoed louder than any scream in the history of the realm. She chose death over the humiliation of surrender, a decision that left the surviving nobles of Cintra with nothing but a hollow castle and a desperate hope that the northern kingdoms would soon march to their aid. They would not come. The Nilfgaardian army, led by Emperor Emhervar Emrys himself, did not pause to gloat or to pillage the empty streets with the chaotic violence of a common mob. They moved with the precision of a machine that had been built for a single purpose: the total dismantling of the Northern Order. Emhyr stood on the ruins of the palace balcony, looking down at the charred remains of a kingdom that had once been the jewel of the North. He was not a man given to theatrical gestures, nor did he seek the adoration of the masses who had yet to hear of the slaughter. His gaze was cold, calculating the cost of the war in terms of gold, grain, and the political leverage of a broken map. He knew that the fall of Cintra was not merely a military victory. It was a psychological blow intended to shatter the will of the other northern rulers. The red of the Nilfgaardian banners did not flutter in the wind. It stood stiff against the gray sky, a symbol of an empire that had finally found its stride. The emperor spoke only to his generals, his voice low and devoid of triumph. "Burn the archives," he said, "but leave the walls standing as a warning." The order was carried out with ruthless efficiency, and the smoke that rose from the burning city drifted south, a black cloud that would hang over the continent for generations. The aftermath of the battle was not a long siege or a negotiated peace, but a sudden, brutal end to the First Northern War. The northern realms, fractured by their own petty squabbles and jealousies, could not unite in time to save their ally. King Foltest of Temeria, King Henselt of Redania, and King Radovid of Redania sat in their respective courts, debating the terms of an alliance that would never come. They spoke of honor and duty, but their armies remained in their camps, waiting for a signal that would never arrive. The Treaty of Cintra was not signed in a grand hall with ink and parchment, but in the silence of the burning city, where the only witnesses were the dead and the conquerors. The emperor dictated the terms, and the northern kings, realizing too late the magnitude of their mistake, signed away their sovereignty in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. The cost of this treaty was measured in the lives of the innocent and the destruction of a culture that had thrived for centuries. The women of Cintra, stripped of their children and their homes, were scattered to the winds, their fates left to the mercy of the soldiers who now ruled the land. The men who had defended the castle were dead, their bodies left to rot in the mud, a final testament to the futility of their resistance. The city itself was razed, its libraries burned, its statues toppled, and its very name erased from the maps of the northern kingdoms. The Nilfgaardians did not seek to rebuild, they sought to erase. The story of Cintra became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children to frighten them into obedience. The queen's leap from the tower was remembered not as an act of courage, but as a warning of the price of defiance. In the courts of the north, the news of Cintra's fall spread like a contagion, spreading fear and uncertainty among the nobility. The kings who had once dreamed of a united northern front now looked to their own borders, wondering if they would be next. The Treaty of Sintra was a death knell for the Old World, a signal that the era of the northern kingdoms was over. The emperor had proven that he could crush any resistance, and the northern kings knew that they could not stand against him alone. The war was over, but the peace that followed was fragile, built on a foundation of blood and ash. The northern realms were no longer a collection of independent kingdoms. They were a collection of vassal states, forced to bow to the will of the south. The impact of the treaty rippled through the continent, affecting the lives of common men and women who had never known war. The trade routes were disrupted, the markets were closed, and the economy of the north collapsed. The people of Sintra, scattered to the winds, became refugees, wandering the roads in search of a home that no longer existed. They carried with them the memory of a city that had been the heart of the North, a symbol of hope and prosperity that had been crushed under the boot of the empire. The story of Sintra became a legend, a myth that would inspire future generations to fight for their freedom. But for now, it was a tragedy that haunted the dreams of the living. The emperor, having secured his victory, turned his attention to the rest of the northern realms. He knew that the Treaty of Sintra was only the beginning of a long and difficult process of subjugation. The northern kings would not surrender without a fight, and the people would not accept their new masters without resistance. The war was over, but the struggle for the soul of the continent had just begun. The seeds of rebellion were already being sown, hidden in the hearts of those who had lost everything. The North would rise again, but it would take time, and the price of that rise would be paid in blood and fire. The Treaty of Sintra was a moment of silence in the storm, a brief pause before the next wave of violence crashed against the shores of the northern realms. In the end, the Treaty of Sintra was not a victory for the empire, but a Pyrrhic triumph that left the continent scarred and divided. The northern kingdoms were broken, but they were not defeated. The spirit of the North was still alive, hidden in the hearts of the people who had lost everything. The story of Sintra was a warning, a reminder of the cost of war and the price of freedom. The bells of the northern cities would ring again, but they would ring for a different song, a song of resistance and hope. The future was uncertain and the road ahead was long and dangerous, but the North would survive, and the story of Sintra would live on as a symbol of the unbreakable spirit of the people. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Sintra was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Sintra did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the North was united. The fracture was complete and the war was not over. The northern realms were broken and the future was uncertain. The story of Sintra was a warning to the future, a reminder of the cost of war. The bells of Sintra did not ring again. The city was a ghost, a memory of a time when the North was united. The snow at Kaer Morhen did not fall softly. It drove against the stone walls like handfuls of grit, burying the northern peaks in a suffocating white shroud. This fortress had stood for centuries, a jagged tooth of gray rock biting into the sky, a sanctuary for those who had traded their humanity for the ability to kill monsters. The school of the wolf was not a school in the traditional sense. There were no classrooms filled with ink and parchment, no lectures on philosophy or history. The curriculum was written in the flesh of the boys who arrived there, and the final exam was always a matter of survival. The great iron gates had been shut tight for decades, sealing the Witchers away from the world that had come to hate them. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of tallow, old leather, and the sharp tang of steel being sharpened. It was a place of routine and silence, broken only by the clang of a hammer on an anvil or the low murmur of Vesemir, teaching the younger ones how to hold a blade. Vesemir walked the corridors of the keep, his boots heavy on the stone floor. He was old, his hair the color of the winter sky, his face a map of scars that told stories of battles long forgotten by the common man. He remembered the faces of the boys who had come before, the ones who had survived the trial of the grasses and the ones who had not. He remembered Tomas. The boy had arrived with Luca and Sven, a small thing with eyes wide with fear, trembling as the alchemists prepared the mutagens. Tomas had been promised to the Witchers by a mother who did not know the child she had given up. The law of surprise had taken him from a life of safety and brought him to a life of steel. Vesemir had tried to comfort him on the night before the trial, sitting by the fire while the boy shivered under a heavy wool blanket. "We will be okay," Vesemir had said, his voice low and rough. "We will survive this." Tomas had looked at the old Witcher, his lips pressed tight, and nodded, though the fear never truly left his eyes. The trial in the Red Swamp had come too soon after the mutations. The boys were thrown into the mud and the rot, armed only with their medallions and their wits. The swamp was a place where the air hung thick with the smell of decay, and the trees seemed to lean in as if to watch them die. Tomas had run when the ghouls came out of the mist, his legs churning the muck, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had not been fast enough. The ghoul had snatched him from behind, its claws tearing through his tunic, and he was gone in a heartbeat. Vesemir had found the boy's medallion days later, half buried in the mud, the silver tarnished by the swamp water. It was a small, cold object, but it carried the weight of a life cut short. The school of the wolf had always been a place of loss, but the death of a child felt different. It felt like a failure of the very purpose they had sworn to uphold. The fire that would consume the keep did not start with a spark of malice, but with the arrogance of a man who believed he could conquer the world. The Brotherhood of Sorceresses, led by a woman named Philippa Eilhart, had made a pact with the Witchers of the Wolf School to stop the Nilfgaardian advance. They had gathered at Kaer Morhen, bringing with them the young recruits and the few remaining masters. The castle was full of people, a strange mix of magic users and monster hunters, all united by a common enemy. The walls were reinforced, the battlements manned, and the great hall was filled with the sound of preparation. But the enemy did not come with an army. They came with a whisper. A Nilfgaardian agent, a man named Vilgefortz, had infiltrated the keep. He wore the face of a scholar, a man of reason and logic, but his heart was cold and calculating. He had studied the Witchers, their methods, their weaknesses, and he had found the flaw in their armor. It was not their steel or their potions. It was their trust. Vilgefortz had waited for the right moment, a moment when the guards were lax and the fire in the great hearth was low. He struck with a blade of cold steel, cutting down the sentries before they could raise the alarm. The fire started in the stables, where the horses were kept, and it spread quickly, fed by the dry wood and the oil stored for the lamps. The flames licked at the thatch of the roofs, turning the gray stone of the keep into a beacon of orange light against the dark sky. Vesemir stood in the courtyard watching the fire grow. He could hear the screams of the boys, the shouts of the sorceresses, and the crackling of the wood as the keep began to collapse. He thought of Tomas, of the boy who had died in the swamp, and he felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. This was the end. The school of the wolf was falling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He reached for his sword, the blade heavy in his hand, and he moved to protect the young recruits. He found them huddled in the corner of the training hall, their eyes wide with terror. "Stay with me," Vesemir said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We will get out of here." The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming the wooden beams and the stone walls. The heat was unbearable and the smoke choked the air, making it hard to breathe. The boys ran through the corridors, following Vesemir as he led them to the secret passage that would take them out of the keep. But the fire had already reached the passage and the way was blocked. Vesemir turned to the boys, his face covered in soot, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Go," he said, pushing them toward a side door that led to the cliffs. "Run, do not look back." The boys ran, their feet slipping on the stone, their hearts pounding in their chests. They ran through the smoke and the fire, guided by the voice of the old witcher who had saved them. Vesemir stayed behind, holding the door against the flames, his sword raised to strike down any who tried to stop them. He thought of the boys who had come before, the ones who had died in the trials, and he thought of Tomas. He thought of the law of surprise and the promise he had made to the world. He would not let the fire take them all. He would buy them time with his own life. The keep burned for days, the flames consuming everything in their path. The stone walls cracked and crumbled, and the great iron gates melted into the ground. The school of the wolf was gone, a memory of a time when the witchers had been the protectors of the world. The boys who had escaped ran through the snow, their clothes torn, their faces black with soot. They carried with them the memory of the fire, the screams, and the sacrifice of the old witcher who had stood between them and the flames. The world would forget the school of the wolf, but the boys would remember. They would remember the fire and the man who had saved them. They would remember the cost of survival and the price of freedom. The snow at Kaer Morhen did not fall softly. It drove against the ruins of the keep, burying the ashes in a white shroud. The story of the school of the wolf was a warning, a reminder of the cost of war and the price of freedom. The bells of the northern cities would ring again, but they would ring for a different song, a song of resistance and hope. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was long and dangerous, but the North would survive, and the story of Kaer Morhen would live on as a symbol of the unbreakable spirit of the people. The sky above the plains of Brenna did not break with the roar of battle, but with a sound like the tearing of wet canvas. It was the sound of reality fracturing, a jagged tear that split the firmament and let the void pour through. The air grew cold, not with the bite of winter, but with the absolute zero of a place where stars were born and died in a single breath. Geralt of Rivia stood at the edge of the breach, his silver sword gripped tight in a hand that trembled only slightly. He had seen monsters in the deep places of the world, beasts that fed on fear and rotted flesh, But nothing prepared him for the creatures spilling from the wound in the sky. They were not of this earth, not of the soil or the blood of men, but of the cold between the stars. Ciri stood beside him, her eyes wide with a terror she had never known. She had traveled through time and space, had walked the corridors of the elder blood and seen the faces of gods, yet this was different. This was not a journey, it was an invasion. The elder blood surged within her veins, a hot river of power that threatened to boil her from the inside out. She felt the pull of the gate, a gravitational drag that tugged at her very soul, urging her to step forward and seal the breach with her own life. She thought of Yennefer, of the woman who had taught her that magic was not just power, but responsibility. Do not let them through, Yennefer had whispered to her in a dream that felt more real than the battlefield before her. You are the key, Cirilla. You are the lock. The creatures poured onto the snow, a tide of chitinous limbs and burning eyes. They moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, ignoring the laws of physics that govern the world below. They did not walk. They flowed over the ground, leaving trails of frost that burned like acid. The northern armies, led by the king of Temeria, stood ready, their spears raised, their shields locked in a wall of steel. But what was a shield against the void? What was a spear against the end of the world? The first charge came with a scream that silenced the birds in the trees and the men in the ranks. The creatures crashed into the lines, and the steel shattered like glass. The men fell, not from wounds, but from the sheer cold that seeped into their bones, freezing their blood in their veins. Geralt moved before he thought, his silver blade flashing in the pale light. He cut down a creature that looked like a wolf made of ice and shadow, its jaws snapping shut on empty air. He felt no satisfaction in the kill, only the grim necessity of it. He was a witcher, a monster hunter, and this was his final hunt. He thought of the boys he had left behind, the ones who had escaped the fire at Kaer Morhen. He thought of the promise he had made to keep the world safe, even if it meant he would not see the dawn. For the boys, he muttered, the words lost in the chaos. He pushed forward, his movements a blur of violence and precision. Ciri watched him for a moment, her heart aching with the fear of losing him again. She had spent years running, years hiding, years believing that she was alone in the world. But now, standing beside him, she knew she was not. She was not just a girl, she was the last hope of the world. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, feeling the pulse of the gate, the rhythm of the tear in the sky. She felt the presence of the elder blood, the ancient power that had been passed down through her line. It was a song of creation and destruction, a song that could heal the wound or widen it until the world was consumed. The creatures surged forward again, a wave of death that swept over the battlefield. The men of the north fought with a desperation that bordered on madness, their swords and spears useless against the void. They fell in droves, their bodies left to freeze in the snow, their faces twisted in agony. The king of Temeria fell first, his crown lost in the mud, his body torn apart by the claws of the invaders. His death was a signal, and the line broke. The men ran, screaming, fleeing from the horror that had come to claim them all. Geralt did not run. He stood his ground, his sword raised high, his eyes fixed on the tear in the sky. He saw the creatures gathering, forming a mass of darkness that threatened to swallow the world. He knew he could not stop them alone. He needed Ciri. He needed the power of the elder blood to close the gate. He turned to her, his face a mask of determination. "Ciri," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You have to do it. You are the only one who can." Ciri looked at him, and in that moment she saw the love in his eyes, the fear for her safety, and the trust that she could do this. She took a deep breath, feeling the power surge within her. She thought of Yennefer, of her mother, of all the people she had lost. She thought of the world she had to save. "I will not let you die," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I will not let the world end." She stepped forward into the path of the creatures. The cold hit her like a physical blow, freezing the air in her lungs, but she did not stop. She raised her hands and the elder blood flared to life, a brilliant light that illuminated the battlefield. The creatures recoiled, their eyes burning with a mixture of fear and hatred. Ciri pushed the power forward, a wave of energy that swept over the battlefield, pushing the creatures back into the gate. The tier in the sky began to close, the edges knitting together, with a sound like tearing fabric. The creatures screamed, a sound that pierced the air and made the men on the battlefield cover their ears. They fought back, trying to hold the gate open, but the power of the elder blood was too strong. They were pushed back, one by one, into the void. The last creature, a massive beast with eyes like burning coals, lunged at Ciri, its jaws wide. Geralt moved faster than thought, his silver blade striking true, severing the beast's head from its body. The creature fell, and the gate closed with a final, thunderous boom. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had stopped, the snow had ceased to fall, and the only sound was the heavy breathing of the survivors. Geralt stood over Ciri, his sword still in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked at her, and for the first time in years he saw her not as a child, but as the woman she had become. She was alive. The world was alive. The battle was over, but the cost was high. The northern armies were decimated, the king was dead, and the world had changed forever. The creatures were gone, but the memory of them would linger in the minds of the survivors. The snow at Brenna was stained with blood, and the sky was scarred with the wound that had almost destroyed the world. Geralt looked out over the battlefield and he saw the future. It was a future of uncertainty, of pain, and of struggle, but it was also a future of hope. The world had survived, and as long as there were people willing to fight for it, it would continue to survive. Ciri stood up, her legs shaking but her spirit unbroken. She looked at Geralt, and he saw the love in her eyes, the gratitude, and the promise of a future together. They had faced the end of the world and they had won. But the victory was hollow, the cost too high. The world would never be the same, and the scars of the battle would remain for generations. But as long as they stood together, they would face whatever came next. The sun began to rise over the plains of Brenna, casting a pale light over the dead and the living. It was a new day, a new beginning, but the shadow of the battle would never truly fade. The world had been saved, but the price had been paid in blood and fire. The story of the Battle of the White Frost would be told for generations, a warning of the cost of war and the power of the elder blood. But for Geralt and Ciri, the story was just beginning. The road ahead was long and dangerous, but they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but they were not afraid. They had faced the end of the world and they had survived. That was enough.